there's lots of technical jiggery pokery going on this end. Brilliant, it is recording. Wonderful,
Do
wonderful.
you still use Audacity? Is that right? Or
No,
I hear there's been issues with them.
yeah,
Yeah.
there's a lot of strange some sort of political shenanigans going on with Audacity. I use it occasionally. I use it for my own recordings, but it's just such a pain
Mm.
to. It's a good system, don't get me wrong. Audacity is a very good program for what it is. It's still the go-to program for this kind of thing, but I just find it very difficult editing everything together using two Audacity tracks. It takes forever,
Mm.
basically. So I use a kind of universal Skype recorder at the moment, which probably isn't as good as a piece of software, but it is much easier.
Yes,
It's just
absolutely.
ease, and at the moment I don't have the time. That's the
No,
thing. I just
I
don't
can
have the
completely
time
relate to that. Yeah.
to mess about with, sorting out audio tracks and syncing them together and all of that. And I'm not very good at it anyway, so
Mm. Mm.
it's easier and actually better to use the cheaper, the nastier little bit of software.
That probably works better from my end because I'm not entirely sure my Audacity is picking up sufficient
Right,
audio. It
got
might
you.
be, but yeah. I'll see. I can send. I suppose I don't need to send you the file if
No,
you've got that
no,
recording.
I shouldn't
But
think so. I mean, this seems to be recording fine this end, so no problem there
excellent.
at all. No, how are you doing, by the way?
Good, good. I got sucked into No Man's Sky this
Oh,
afternoon. So
oh
yes,
no!
it's very yeah. It's one of those games that it's hard to even say why it's so compelling.
I have
Um,
it is the strangest experience. I picked it up when it first came out, the much maligned first edition of No Man's Sky, which of course suffered from some hyperbolic press, I think it's fair to say.
yeah.
But I actually really liked it in its original incarnation. It was an odd beastie. It was a game, quote unquote, unlike any other I'd ever played, because it didn't really have any objective or parameters or anything like that. You just
Mm.
wandered around, really. But the expanse of it was so compelling. The fact that it was this entire universe with procedurally generated worlds to explore and races that would develop, and I found it really
Mm.
compelling. It's developed a lot since then. It's become much more what was originally advertised. I think it's a beautiful piece of work myself.
Yeah. Yeah.
I
I just need to get off the first planet. I've lost my ship.
Yes, that's always an issue. It's always an issue getting off the first planet because it's luck of the draw. You may be on a world that's rich in resources, or where you
Mm.
may even have a civilization already, so you can just go and get the bits you need to repair your ship. Or you may be in some terrible desolation where you've got to spend hours mining and refining and doing
Mm.
craft work in order to get your ship off the ground. It's I've always likened it to like the feeling of it to me is like a prog rock album cover. It's
Mm.
like just sitting and zoning out to music. It's kind of the opposite of most other games at the moment.
Yes, yeah, it really does feel almost. It's weird because the technology obviously it relies on is quite sophisticated
Hmm.
and new, but it has a very 90s feel in a lot of its mentality.
Totally, totally.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
reminds me so much. Certainly the original version of it, the one that I tend to refer to because I haven't played it for a long time, is it reminds me of experiences on my old Commodore Amiga. That's what
Mm,
it feels like. These games that are not necessarily games, they're more like some kind of strange simulator, because there were lots of those on the Amiga back in the day, despite the incredible limitations they operated under. Things like flight sims and that kind of thing, which were
mm.
incredibly detailed. Incredibly detailed in the sense that they were legitimately flight simulators. You had to get everything right, otherwise your plane or helicopter or whatever would crash or not even get off the ground.
Mm, mm. No,
No,
it's got definitely got that whole feel to it. That kind of fascination with the environment
hmm.
and your interaction with it over anything
Yeah.
like a narrative or yeah.
I
I
mean,
mean, there is a sense of narrative
mhm.
almost in it, but that's sort of your interactions generate that, which I
Definitely.
also like.
I mean, in the original incarnation, it was even less. There was largely nothing. Really, you were just going from world to world, exploring what they were like and what strange creatures and fauna had developed on them. And that was it. That was largely it. Occasionally, you'd find some alien monolith or temple or something that would give you some scrap of very obscure, very poetic narrative. And that was it. That was largely it. I don't even know. I mean, there must have been somewhere, but I never discovered any wider sense of a narrative that could be completed, or where you would find the totality of it, or anything like that. And I kind of liked that. I mean, loads of people didn't. Oh wow, loads of people didn't. It was a bit of a scandal.
I remember at the time, because there was so much hype. So people went from saying this was going to change all gaming to this was sort of the biggest fraud in gaming history.
Yeah, I think the problem was the manner of its marketing. I mean, if it stayed what it originally was, which is, say, it was a small indie studio, and if it was released as an indie game rather than being picked up by Sony and marketed as though it were sort of like a big AAA game, I think the reviews would have been much kinder. I think it would have had a place in history. You know, I think it would have been remarked upon as one of the most interesting indie games ever made. As it stands, because it was marketed as a kind of AAA experience, a mainstream experience, and it had a AAA price.
Yes,
that was problematic.
And it still does, kind of. Like, I got it on sale, but they're doing so much to it constantly. They haven't really massively reduced the cost.
No.
So there's still quite a high asking entry fee. Definitely.
There is. I mean, it's way more worth it now, because there's just so much more to it now than there was. I mean, there are all the different game modes. There's so much more in the way of construction and civilizations you can encounter now. So many more different environments and alien species than there were in the original version of the game. I mean, really, the original version of the game, not to be too uncharitable, but it was kind of a beta version. It wasn't really finished.
It's amazing how many AAA games that's true for.
Yes, yeah. Yeah, I know, right?
I mean, the obvious recent example, which is bad for a whole host of reasons, would be the Cyberpunk game. Of
course, Cyberpunk, and again, hype. It's a victim of its own hype, because, and also of timing, of course. I mean, Cyberpunk could have been that game that defined the current generation of console games. It really could. It already has a massive audience behind it because of the popularity of cyberpunk fiction, but also of the RPG that it's derived from. It could have been amazing, and it had a lot. Again, just so much advertising and hype behind it. The ideas were good, and I can see how with maybe 12 months more development, it could have been an amazing game.
Yes, yeah. Although perhaps not the amazing game they promised, because they seem to be advertising things that are just beyond the capacities of a game.
That's the problem, isn't it? There's the whole Peter Molyneux effect. It really does. The problem is they don't seem to get it, that the video game public is very aware. They tend to be very technically aware of what constitutes a good game, you know? And there's just so much more in the way of independent media out there for video games than there is for cinema or for literature or whatever, and they will go for the throat, you know? A lot of these independent critics, they will just tell you flat out, no, it's a terrible game. It's not what was advertised, you know? Interestingly, the phenomena of a sort of mainstream game journalism, which was sort of bought and paid for by particular companies, it's gone the way of the dodo. It's almost dead now.
Yeah, I do vaguely remember that, when I would occasionally buy a gaming magazine and it was just sort of, well, basically advertisement.
Pretty much. Games. I mean, I do recall back in the 16-bit era when you had magazines devoted to particular consoles or particular companies, like the official Nintendo magazine and the official Sega magazine, and they would never give. You had to, and I most of us even learned this even as kids. You had to moderate the scores that they gave them. You had to interpret them creatively, so they would never give anything below, say, 50%. They'd never give anything below 50%, although there was plenty that deserved it. So you had to sort of moderate your expectations. If something was getting 60%, it was probably really a 30% game. And so on and so forth. It was very difficult to determine what was legitimate and what was not.
Yeah. I mean, I think back then, and probably today as well, word of mouth is probably the surest way of
probably the strongest
sorting through games. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, really, the whole independent market relies on that at this point.
Yes.
And it works.
I mean, they can't hype up games because they just don't have the capacity to blitz media in the same way.
But it does work. I mean, there are quite a few recent examples of hits that have actually outsold a lot of AAA games. I mean, we had the latest version of The Binding of Isaac. Obviously, that did gangbusters. That's only out on PC at the moment. That did gangbusters. Isn't even out on the consoles yet. It'll do gangbusters again when it's out on the consoles. Undertale is probably one of the classic examples at the moment. That is clearly it's part of video game history now. Before that, we had Five Nights at Freddy's, which was a kind of the same thing. You know, it was just hype. The only reason Five Nights at Freddy's did well is because it did well for Let's Players.
I mean, that's the other thing. Like, there's all these alternative ways of advertising games beyond word of mouth and you know, YouTube obviously and Twitch and such are now huge, and designing games for those mediums.
That's literally for those mediums. I mean, Five Nights at Freddy's is made for Let's Players. It is just made for Let's Players. All of the problems concerning its creator aside, it's not only made for Let's Players, but it also has that lore thing going on, which is also huge on the internet. You know, the notion of unpicking secret or implied lore, which I've got to say I'm a big fan of. I really do enjoy a bit of Nick Nocturne or that kind of thing. You know, those channels that take your ARGs or your video games and try to unpick the lore. Vati Video is another one I absolutely love. The guy who does the Dark Souls lore and Bloodborne and whatnot. And
on the other hand, like, I think the Let's Plays have sort of discouraged certain games. So I think especially with walking simulator style games, Let's Plays are kind of a mixed curse, really, because yes, they can kind of get your game famous, but on the other hand, it's actually quite easy to enjoy those games entirely through the Let's Play without buying.
Right, which is problematic, isn't it? That is rather problematic, because you are actually, because those games, I mean, don't get me wrong, I love what's called walking simulators. I absolutely love them. But there is this thing with a lack of feedback in them. There's a sort of lack of kinetic feedback that people get from video games generally. So you can sit and just watch them and you'll get the experience.
Yes, absolutely. And I also enjoy those games a lot. And I think the best ones can counteract that somewhat with environmental factors or the way in which you interact with things. I played one not too long ago called it was about a family curse, or What Remains of Edith Finch.
Oh, that's beautiful.
That. Yeah. Such a good game.
Oh, What Remains of Edith Finch is absolutely glorious, isn't it?
There's that particular level where you're one of the brothers and you're at the fish factory, and as you do this monotonous task, which you of course do in the game, of chopping the heads off fish, it's kind of presented almost like a mini game. Of course, there's no actual game mechanics in it, because you're just endlessly doing this repetitive action, but you're also telling this kind of fantasy story, which of course he's using to escape from these mundane circumstances. I felt that was a really good use of the mechanics of a walking simulator. Like it kind of tricks you into paying attention to two things at once, so it really creates that experience.
There's almost like a satire of the way video games are generally programmed, isn't there? You know, it's very, very clever indeed. But I mean, I just love the beauty of Edith Finch. I thought the game was visually stunning, and like atmospherically, the way it tells story largely through atmosphere, I thought was wonderful. Wonderful.
there's not many other games where you get to become an owl
No.
and like dive bomb rabbits.
No, really not.
Yeah.
Really not. Another one that's really, really weird. What's it called? The latest one from Hideo Kojima and his studio. What was it called? Death Stranding. Death Stranding. I really enjoyed. Enjoyed is a weird word for Death Stranding because it's. I was talking to a friend of mine about this recently. He said, "Would you ever Let's Play?" I said, "No, no. I don't even know how you'd do it. I don't know how you'd do it. It'd be so boring for a Let's Player to do, because the audience wouldn't be getting anything. It's a despair simulator. It's a despair simulator. It's got this feeling about it where it induces depression, which is
I've
quite.
only seen adverts, but
It's the oddest experience. It shouldn't work. Even when you're playing it, you're thinking this should not work, and then 4 hours go by, and you're
that's the test of how compelling a game
Right.
is. I mean, that's like definitely my experience with No Man's Sky. Like, I should just be getting annoyed not getting off this planet,
and yet
not even being able to find my ship.
And yet.
Yeah.
Those hours do tick by, don't they?
Yes, they do. Yeah, like you're just going through a cave, and it's the environments, I think, more than anything. Like, there's just a sense of even the way that light works in the game. You can just stop, and you can't stop for too long because your suit is constantly being attacked by the environment.
Yeah.
But you can stop for small periods and just enjoy where you are. And yeah, there's not many games where even really well rendered games somehow just don't create that same sense of immersion.
No, I mean it's a derivation of the kind of thing that you get in some of the better open world games. For my money, the best open world games are ones where they just immerse you in the world more than anything, and it's a sincere joy to trek across them. That's it.
Yeah.
Most of the time, any primary narrative or whatever can go to hell. It doesn't really factor into the experience. There's an experiential quality to them, which I think the best ones actually play into. Because almost always, narrative is doomed to failure in them. It's almost always doomed to failure.
It ends up being too sparse because how you fit that into that world ends up like either like fragmented little bits or like some artificial funnel through this vaster universe.
Absolutely.
And yeah, neither approach is really satisfying.
No,
yeah,
it doesn't work for me. I mean, the only one, the best I can think of are the ones that are created by Obsidian. Obsidian did Fallout New Vegas, which is easily the best of the Fallout games. That actually has a very good narrative, and utilizes the open world format in very myriad and interesting ways. It's one of the very few I've played where what you do actually has a real effect on the world. Like a real effect. You will find certain tribes and peoples will not like you because of things that you've done. And you don't have any indication until someone tells you why. You may just wander into an area after completing a particular mission, and suddenly people are attacking you, and you're sort of, well, I haven't done anything to upset these people. Why is that? And then you'll go somewhere else, and someone will tell you, or you'll realize because you explore a particular area, and you'll see you've done something that affects their way of life, and that's awesome. That is stunning. All of the decisions you make all have effects on how the Mojave Wasteland ultimately comes out at the end, what the shape of it is politically, and that's fantastic. It's something none of the other Fallout games do. Not a one of them does that, and that's because it was made by Obsidian rather than Bethesda.
Yes, definitely a good alternative. And yeah, it's very hard to pull off. Like, you see, I've recently been enjoying the Necromunda Hired Gun game. Which
is it good?
It's weird. It's fun.
Right. Okay.
It's very fun. So it's basically a Doom knockoff.
Okay, fair enough.
It's Doom, but in Warhammer 40,000.
Okie dokie.
But they also try to do elements of that kind of, like, you interact with the world, but it has no consequence on the main narrative. So you can end up being like very popular with one of the Necromunda gangs, whilst simultaneously in the story you're mostly fighting them. So like there's weird narrative dissonances. If you can, and it has like some janky animations and stuff. It's not quite as seamless as Doom because it obviously doesn't have anything like the same budget.
Clearly,
but it is entertaining. It's entertaining to have like a working class like woman main character with a like thick English accent in a Doom style game. There's something like really incongruous about like how the character sounds relative to most of these games.
It's kind of ironic because Necromunda, I mean, if they could somehow get a big studio involved with a big budget for that license, Necromunda is the perfect license for an open world RPG. So is.
Yeah. I mean, I think they're teasing elements of that in this game. Like, it's clear that it is mostly a Doom game, but I think they've there's a lot of like weapon customization, which is okay. It doesn't make a big enough difference to be worth bothering about.
A game like Doom.
Yes, exactly. Like it kind of it's just basically modeled on Doom, but is slightly pretending to be other things at the same time.
Got you. Okay.
But I mean, I would recommend it. I've spent like 18 hours on it, which I think justifies the price.
I'm just surprised they've never managed to do the, say, a 40k or AOS game that works, that is absolutely bangingly brilliant, because you'd think the license, the Warhammer setting and its characters, you'd think it would be perfect fodder for a video game, wouldn't you?
I think they've come close in various. They're good at like very specific things. So like Vermintide is very fun for what it is. It's not too ambitious.
Yeah.
But like I prefer it over I can't remember the zombie game. Is it Left 4 Dead? It's basically very much modeled on that. I prefer it to I guess that is to Left 4 Dead what Necromunda is to Doom. Except I think Vermintide maybe surpasses Left 4 Dead, whereas Necromunda is clearly Doom's in view.
Yes.
So yeah, I mean they do some things well. I'm not really into, and I've never really been very good at the Total War games. So the Total War Warhammer games,
the sort of RTS style games,
they've never really worked for me. I mean, the last RTS games I really enjoyed was probably like StarCraft 2 or something.
So a while back.
Yes.
Quite a while back.
Time ago.
Well, I mean, RTSs have kind of died a death, haven't they? It's one of those game genres that really doesn't exist very much anymore, outside of very, very niche circles.
Yeah. I mean, you certainly don't find many of those kind of classic sort of like Red Alert style,
Command and Conquer, that kind of thing. It's a shame, really, because I rather enjoyed a lot of them. I think there is. I mean, I understand why there can be a sort of navel gazing quality to them sometimes, where it is resource management and cultivating your armies and whatnot. But I kind of liked that. Again, it's a throwback to the old Amiga days when those things were actually everywhere.
Yeah, I mean, I've been getting like some of those old RTS games out of nostalgia, but I haven't really played any of them. The one that I probably will play at some point that I used to play a huge amount was Total Annihilation,
Annihilation, yeah.
Yeah, like I love the premise of that game because it's so wonderfully and whimsically nihilistic. These two robot legions were created and they're programmed to fight each other, and so they do, and all the life forms are just gone. So there's no ideology behind the war. They're just doing what they're
supposed to do.
And that's just a fantastic, very, very of its time feel for a premise for a game.
I do remember in like around the early 2000s, there was a kind of renaissance of them where you got a lot of, certainly on the PC, not on the consoles so much because they were very difficult to do on consoles back then, but on the PC there was this kind of renaissance of the RTS where they basically went into space. So suddenly you had these three-dimensional RTSs where you were commanding space fleets and things like that, like Homebound, for example. Homebound was gorgeous. I remember playing that a lot, where you had to assemble fleets of spaceships and move between different civilizations and colonies and star systems. That was beautiful at the time. I remember it being awe-inspiring at the time. Probably looks terrible these days.
It's always frightening to go back to those games, especially if you remember them. I mean, I don't have any memories of Total Annihilation being especially pretty, so it doesn't really bother me on that. But if you remember them being very pretty, it's always a bit of a concern. I mean, I think that's one of the glories of the Infinity Engine games, but because of how that engine works, they don't really lose any of their aesthetic appeal,
right?
Which is just which is good, because Baldur's Gate 2, I really wouldn't want to be tarnished.
No, that is the thing, isn't it? What I find with video games is those that are the most stylized are the ones that don't lose anything. So a really good example, Baldur's Gate is a great example, because of course it chose, they chose to do a very old-fashioned isometric, very, very basic graphically presentation for that game, and they chose that deliberately at a time when graphics engines and graphics cards and processors were escalating in capacity just beyond anybody's imagination, and what a great decision. What that has done has meant that they maintain their charm and their aesthetic. In fact, I don't like a lot of the three-dimensional role-playing games of a similar ilk. Don't like them.
It's very rare that I get as emotionally invested in those games, and I think the look of them is... I mean, I actually remember my disappointment of the first Neverwinter Nights. I haven't played the second, and I've heard it's a lot better, so maybe I should temper with it.
I totally agree. I mean, when Neverwinter Nights came out, I remember it was touted as being, this is going to be the next Baldur's Gate, essentially. It's going to be incredible. And not only... I mean, graphically, it wasn't great shakes at the time, and narratively it was dull.
It was. The second you got out of that first place, the city, with the disease city was kind of tropey, but it was fine. It worked to a point, but then they just obviously didn't have a narrative direction.
Clearly,
and they just threw all kinds of weird things at you, including like the people who had been like the paradigms of virtue becoming suddenly the betrayers,
which was obvious from the beginning anyway.
Because you never set up somebody as like, this is the goodie, and then like 100 arrows suddenly point to them saying this is the good guy. It's just...
I recall
it's just silly.
You could go around Neverwinter, around the city, and they were like dispensing blessings, quote unquote, to cure the sickness. And if you got a blessing from them, all this like red light, it was so clearly a negative thing, a curse.
Yes.
All this red light would come around your character, and it would literally say cursed. And you're like, oh, right, so they're not helping then. Okay. And then, of course, you found out that the people behind the curse and the disease were lizard people. And it was like, well, I don't care. I literally don't care.
Back to that game that wasn't terrible.
Actually, the add-ons, the DLCs are good. The DLCs are really good. There were two. There was the one... Undrentide. Shadows of Undrentide was the first one. And the second one, I can't remember what the second one was called, but they were actually pretty good.
Which was the one in the desert? Because where you get a kobold companion.
That's Undrentide. That's Undrentide. That's where you find the city that's buried under the sands, and it like rises up. But I think it can fly, if I remember correctly. Deacon the kobold.
Yes,
I remember him.
I would have him in like my like dream D&D party alongside Minx. He stands out as like a really well developed character. Odd for him to come out of Neverwinter Nights.
Because most of the characters are pretty dull, aren't they? Most of the characters are dull.
Baldur's Gate and all of those Infinity Engine games have so many good characters.
I am still trying to get Planescape to work properly on the PS4, but that's probably my favourite of them, Planescape Torment, simply because of, if nothing else, the setting.
Yes.
Oh, God, Sigil is so well realised in that game. And everything about it, the way Sigil even is inconstant, the way it changes, it actually does change in the game, The parameters of the city actually change as the story goes on, and areas that you could access, you can't access anymore. every character, every tiny little interaction is complex and interesting. And because it is Sigil, all the characters you can have in your party are wildly different.
Yeah.
They're all fascinating. They're all fascinating outside of any kind of bounds of morality or even basic assumption. They're wonderful characters.
I was enjoying the Let's Plays that you posted where you were recruiting the succubus character, who's not
she's awesome.
typical of a succubus.
No, she's an odd one. She's a very
Yeah.
peculiar one. I'm trying to recruit at the moment. I mean, I am going to go back to it when I can get it working properly, but it's still having those issues with the areas that don't load in properly. And sometimes the HUD doesn't load in properly, so you can't actually access it. And it actually did something recently, which is why I haven't gone back to it for a while. It dropped one of my saves, and I had to go back and do lots of stuff. And I kind of lost patience and thought, forget it. I'll do it.
Yeah,
I'll do it on Steam or something. I'll do it on PC. Why not?
Yeah, there's only so much you can take from a game.
Yeah.
After a while, it's a
shame because I love the fact they're available on the PS4. I love the fact they released them for the PS4 because it means other people can access them now. But I wish they'd done a better job.
I'm really hoping they do a good job with the Bloodborne port to PC.
Wow,
that's what I'm
yes.
mostly looking forward to.
Wow, I'm sure they will.
Yeah.
I mean, they're generally, FromSoft are very good with their ports.
Yeah.
They tend to dedicate a lot to their PC ports. I mean, the PC ports of all the Dark Souls games are pretty good.
In
fact,
I'm playing Dark Souls 2 currently, and it's really enjoyable.
Dark Souls 2 is great. I mean, I feel I was a bit hard on it in my Let's Play because I started with the add-on. What's it called? The Scholar of the First Sin. Scholar of the First Sin, which makes the game a million times harder.
I think I have got that version. So
yeah, apparently it is. That's like hard mode. Scholar of the First Sin. It changes from the original game. It changes so much. It actually even changes like enemy placement and how many enemies are in any given area, their activation ranges, and all that kind of thing. So yeah, it is difficult. It's more difficult, I would say, than most of the other Dark Souls games. But I do love what it does with the lore and the metaphysics and the setting. Drangleic is awesome.
Yes, yeah. I was just sort of taking screenshots of the place around the sort of burning lighthouse. I'm not sure what area that's called.
Oh my goodness, yes.
That area is incredible. And just the enemies in that area are really entertaining to fight. They have like there's kind of a fairness to them, even if they are difficult, because they have like a very set move pattern. So if you're patient, you invariably do win out.
That's the big thing with Dark Souls 2, I found. I mean, my problem was I started with Bloodborne, which is you could not come at the Dark Souls games like Bloodborne or vice versa. They look similar because they use the same engine, the same basic controls. You can't play them like one another. If you do, you fail. You just fail. Bloodborne is so much more aggressive.
Yeah.
It's so much more aggressive than Dark Souls. If you play Bloodborne defensively, you die. You just die.
Yeah, you almost play Bloodborne in the same mentality, obviously totally different game as you would play Doom.
Yeah.
For similar reasons, of course, because of course with Doom, if you play defensively, you won't regain your health. And
absolutely.
And the same with Bloodborne. It's exactly how you.
And it's just those tiny little changes, like the detail in Bloodborne where, if you're injured, you are given that slight chance to hit the enemy, and that regains you some health. That little mechanic that separates it from Dark Souls is essential to master, and it forces you to play aggressively. Another thing, of course, is in Dark Souls you generally roll away from the enemy. You take a step back and you wait for them to swing or go through a particular animation style. In Bloodborne, if you do that, they will come after you and they will kill you. You roll towards them. You always roll into the enemy. And that helps. That helps a great deal. And you don't wait. You don't give them chance. That's what the priest, who is generally the first boss most people fight, Father Gascoigne. He's designed to teach you that. It's why he's such a bastard. It's why a lot of people don't get past him. A lot of people give up.
He's sort of like he's this sort of training boss.
But he's not like most training bosses. He's actually harder than many of the other bosses in the game. It's designed to show you how difficult the game is, how punishing it is, and just the style you're supposed to play in, which is don't back away from him. Don't play a dance with him. If you do, he'll just keep coming after you, and he will kill you. You've got to get right in there. It took me ages to learn that in Dark Souls, you do the opposite. Sorry, no, go on.
Have you given Sekiro a try? Because I've only just got that. I haven't played it yet.
Sekiro is really interesting.
Yeah.
I loved it. It is technically probably the most accomplished of those games. But it's not as interesting to me narratively or in terms of its mythology or its aesthetics or its metaphysics. Don't get me wrong, it's good. It's actually very interesting. But it is like, the duels from Dark Souls and Bloodborne, where you're fighting against another player or another, like an NPC character.
Absolutely, yeah.
Almost every encounter in it is like them.
That makes sense with the world lore and the background.
Right.
So it's actually set pieces then. That's what it looks like.
Yeah, it's duels, essentially. It is a game of escalating duels, and they are really interesting, and technically it's loads of fun. Because you've got to learn, it is the synthesis of that whole ethos where you've just got to learn how the enemies work. You've got to watch them. You've got to get their tells down. If you don't, they will slaughter you. The first enemies you encounter will just massacre you, and they often will. They often will. It's very beautiful, and I feel like I'm damning it with faint praise, but it's not my favourite of those games. Not because of any issue with the technicals or anything like that. I'd say it's probably the most refined and the most accomplished of those games in terms of its technicals. But it doesn't interest me as much as Dark Souls or Bloodborne, because I love my monsters. I love my monsters,
yes.
and I love my gribbly lore, and I love all that stuff. So
I'm still very besotted with Dark Souls 1, having finished it. It was such an experience.
It's so good, isn't it? I love the fact that all the way through you are told about Gwyn. And he's built up as the god of gods. He's the creator of Anor Londo. When you first come upon Anor Londo, and it is utopian, it's magnificent. It is the city on the hill, It is like a revelation of the kingdom of heaven. It is incredible. And then you find him.
Yes, and he's pathetic.
Right.
And the music. I mean, the music is of course famous for creating that feeling of dreariness and decay and sadness.
He's so desperate. That's what I get from. He's so desperate to keep you away from that flame, because it's the last flickering ember of the fire of his metaphysics that he's set up, and he's afraid you're going to snuff it out.
Yeah.
Oh,
which
wow.
actually I did.
Yes, me too. That's the path I always follow in the Dark Souls games.
It's hard to justify the other course because you're just setting it all in motion again, which just feels,
That's it, isn't it? I mean,
hellish.
In Dark Souls 1, I can understand why you might go for rekindling the flame, because you don't know who to believe. Do you believe Frampt, or do you believe the other serpent?
Yeah.
They both lie to certain degrees, or at least distort what they're telling you. But if you do listen to Frampt, it does become apparent that Gwyn's flame is a perversion of the true metaphysics of this universe. And in fact, the Abyss is probably the way it's supposed to go. The Abyss is probably the truth of this universe. But when Dark Souls 2 rolls around, and it's another thing I love about Dark Souls 2, the fact that it establishes that it doesn't matter. This universe is cyclical.
Yeah.
the kingdoms rise and die and muster themselves and then fall again regardless of what decision you make.
It's that sense of futility that's like affirmed in Dark Souls 2, and then of course the futility is subverted, I guess, in Dark Souls 3, but in a bleak way.
In a very bleak way. I mean, what you get in Dark Souls 3 is it's the stuttering of the engine. So in Dark Souls, just as in Dark Souls 2, I mean, Drangleic doesn't come directly after Lordran. It's like there are hundreds of kingdoms that have gone before, hundreds of different permutations of this reality that have gone before, fragments of which still linger around, of course, because it never entirely recycles the universe. There's always bits and pieces and fragments all over the place. In Dark Souls 3, in Lothric, the amount of time that's passed between from Dark Souls 2 and Dark Souls 1 is immeasurable. It's immeasurable, and it's the end. It's the point at which this metaphysics that Gwyn set up is truly dying, where there's no one to kindle the flames now. All of those who should have done it have said no. We're not doing it. We're going to follow our own paths, and we're going to set up our own metaphysics, and some of them are nearly there.
Yes, yeah. I mean, of course, Bloodborne may well be that.
It very well may. It never ever states that they exist in the same multiverse or anything like that. But given the states of those multiverses and the few elements that cross over between them, I think it's fair to say they probably do.
Yes.
There are just little things, you know.
I would be surprised if that wasn't in the back of their heads. Like it just feels too implied, and the element of the painted world was also just so perfect.
I love that. I love the painted world metaphysics in these games, and I love the fact that, like in Dark Souls 1, it's just the DLC. The painted world is just an excuse to get some DLC in the game, you know.
Yes.
But it's fed into the wider metaphysics to the point whereby in Dark Souls 3, in order to understand what's happening, you need to play the painted world of Ariane. You need to play the painted world, and in fact the painted world influences the other DLC, the Ringed City, because of course Slave Knight Gale, who is the character who comes from the painted world, who ultimately ends up being the last entity in all of creation at the end of everything that you fight at the end of all things. He's from the painted world, and he's actually still seeking the pigment that the painter needs to create a new world, which a lot of people believe is ultimately Yharnam. Kind of cool. I love it.
That is really good. I mean, like also it complexifies the metaphysics of Dark Souls so much to have that escape hatch and to have it in that still bleak, but also kind of. It's redemptive if you're willing to accept the sort of Lovecraftian monstrousness of it.
Yes,
I guess, which is,
Well, in Dark Souls 3, I mean, one of the key players, one of the key characters derives from the painted world of Ariandel, Pontiff Sullivan. Pontiff Sullivan, who is as close to an antagonist as you get in Dark Souls 3. He is essentially a refugee from the painted world of Ariandel. He's a sorcerer who escaped from that world when he was a child, from a world of rot and decay, a world that's dying, essentially. And of course he escapes into Lothric and finds just another world that's dying, another metaphysics that's fading around him. And he's the one who influences the five lords who are supposed to sacrifice themselves to rekindle the flame. He's the one who convinces them not to say no, we can do better. That's what Pontiff Sullivan essentially says. We can do better. And when you find him, he's in this place called Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, which is, when you emerge upon it, it is so much like Anor Londo. It's kind of scary. It has that wonderful poetry going on. He's essentially established himself not only as the pontiff of this land, but as the arch god of this world. And you find out, of course, that it is Anor Londo. If you go through Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, you ultimately end up in Dark Souls 3's incarnation of Anor Londo, and you find that the gods have been reborn in this cycle. All of them. Guinevere, Gwyndolin, Gwyn, they're all here. after ascent, and Pontiff Sullivan has ingratiated himself with them and betrayed them. He's either sealed them away, murdered them, corrupted them, or he's fed them to Aldrich, the devourer of gods. It's it's a creepy and horrible thing, but at the same time I kind of see where Pontiff Sullivan is coming from.
Yeah, I mean, try to stake out something in that universe makes sense. Like, there's not really much else you can do other than to decay into it.
Right. I mean,
which, of course, traps you into the cycle. So,
yeah, what are you going to do? What other choice do you have other than to play the Lucifer of that universe? What other choice do you sincerely have? When you actually do find Aldrich, the devourer of gods, he's actually established in the highest temple of Anor Londo, the temple that's dedicated to Gwyn, with the big statue of Gwyn, where you fight, in Dark Souls 1, you fight Ornstein and Smo there. That's where Aldrich is. So, and his filth, his excrement, because he's essentially this, he's like the Blob. He's this gigantic snake-like mass of filth in which there are bodies and half-consumed forms writhing about. He's corrupted the entirety of Anor Londo. His excrement and his filth is just everywhere, and it's alive. It's sort of corrupting the architecture of Anor Londo. It's like the ultimate desecration of Gwyn's lineage.
Yeah,
it's kind of cool. It's kind of cool.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think like the way that these games lean into the horror of their universes and this kind of Gnosticism where there's no God outside of the illusion. So I mean that's what you get a lot from the first game.
Loads,
in the sense that like not just from Gwyn at the end, which I think is the final firming up of that, but there's hints all the way up.
Definitely,
that. Like the way in which like the gods trade in illusions and the creation of these cycles, the way in which they have this pomposity that seems actually very fragile when you actually confront them. And like they know there's nothing higher than this and that it's all kind of smoke and mirrors.
Yes, I mean, that really comes to a head when you get to Anor Londo, of course. The funny thing is, you don't have to follow that path. You can leave Anor Londo under the illusion that it is this great shining city on the hill. However, if you do see through the illusion, which you have to destroy the illusion of Guinevere, I believe, because you find Guinevere and she's this beautiful sort of bounteous goddess of light, and she tells you, oh, you need to rekindle the flame, chosen one, and blah 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 blah. But if you throw a fireball at her, the illusion shatters. And you realize that she is actually an illusion, that the other child, the other sibling, Gwyndolin, is projecting.
Yeah, and fighting Gwyndolin is actually like it's arguably more tragic in its feel than the final fight. Like it has this real pathos to it.
I love Gwyndolin. Gwyndolin is my favourite character in the first Dark Souls. I think the character is stunningly beautiful. I mean, the design of the character, more than anything, is beautiful. But there's also this very sad desperation about the character. I mean, we already know that the character is kind of the lesser of Gwyn's children. The character's almost regarded as a something to shut away, to keep away from the populace, you know? And yet the character is still trying to maintain this facade, to maintain the establishment of their father. There's something very sad about that. There's something very... the character must know, on some level, that it's over. It's
the
closest
you get to villainy in the game is probably is it Seath the Scaleless?
Seath the Scaleless, yeah, of
but
course.
Even there, like you have to have like a great deal of respect for what he's trying to do. Like
Seath
trying to maintain immortality and the cleverness, of course, of the trap that you're placed into. Is just really, really, and then the fact that it sort of doesn't work for really a technicality.
Right.
Like it's, you're almost not on your character's side. It's like I remember whenever I got to the part in Baldur's Gate 2 where Irenicus is most victorious, the villain in that game, and you're trapped in the asylum. Like, eventually, I think you end up having a lot of sympathy for Irenicus, but at that point, you just hate John Irenicus.
You hate his guts at that point, yeah.
There's like a smugness to how completely he's destroyed you.
Yes.
And, but, like, with Seath the Scaleless, like, even though there's that similar sort of, like, you've been completely humbled by this brilliant adversary, the fact that it doesn't work almost seems cruel.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Everything right.
Well, the thing about Seath is, he is almost the author of everything. Beyond Gwyn, he's the author of everything, because he's one of the original dragons. He is one of the creatures that existed before flame, before light, before life even. He precedes the gods. And he betrays the other dragons, and thereby allows Gwyn and these newly risen gods to destroy them, to desolate them. So this entire metaphysics only exists because of Seath.
Yeah, he's the sort of element of the primordial that allows for something else.
Yeah, definitely.
And in an act of betrayal as well.
An act of genocidal betrayal. Genocidal betrayal. I love the fact as well that he is echoed in Dark Souls 3, just like everything. In Dark Souls 3, if you could somehow contrive to have someone playing Dark Souls 1 beside it, you would see how it all rhymes. Or it almost retreads the same story plot. So there is a character in Dark Souls 3 who is essentially becoming Seath. Osiris, the king, what's he called? The something king. When you find him, he's transforming into a big blue dragon. He is essentially Seath the Scaleless, this universe's incarnation of Seath the Scaleless, which is fantastic. Dark Souls 2 does that as well, of course. You've got the great souls of the original gods. They all exist in Dark Souls 2 in different incarnations. So there's Nito's new form in Dark Souls 2. The big, I can't remember what it's called, the big mass of corpses that's got the big cleaver.
I ended up sort of ruining the Nito fight a little bit by getting way too powerful coming up to it. So Nito was like this incredibly underwhelming. Like I was all sort of like, hyped up because Nito's got like quite a long introduction and then like just dead within like, 2 minutes.
Nito, there are ways of doing Nito that make him so easy. I mean, he is almost always the last of the great souls that you get in Dark Souls 1. You can do some of the others beforehand, but he's usually the last one. And by that point, you're often... if you play a Pyromancer, forget it. He is so easy. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. I love how he's built up. I love that the notion that he's the first entity to experience death in this universe.
Yes.
That's kind of brilliant. I love that. And I love the way he looks and everything. And his environment is really cool. But my God, is he easy.
Yeah. Not like the only boss, I think, that wasn't a challenge at all. I mean, there's some that were definitely harder than others, obviously. But, like, Nito just doesn't rate as a boss almost.
The one I think I had the most trouble with is probably the Five Kings in New Londo.
I think I was quite high level when I fought those as well, so that wasn't as difficult.
Well, I found a naughty trick with them. I found a really naughty trick with them. All you need to do, if you've got all of Havel's set, so all of his armor, that big dragon tooth thing that he wields as a club, and Havel's ring, put them on. They can't hurt you.
That's brilliant.
It is almost impossible for them to hurt you while you've got all that armor on, and you've got Havel's shield as well. And all you do is tank them, and that works a treat.
I think I vaguely remember you doing that in the Let's Play.
I think that's how I did it in the Let's Play, to be honest.
Because I remember it seeming odd, like, because you didn't have like a tanky character and you were putting like ridiculously heavy armor. And my experience of the game is somewhat shaped by the fact that I co-op the whole thing. So I'm playing it with my brother, and so I fight all the bosses twice.
Got you.
And I obviously have. I mean, they obviously increased the damage
Uh-huh.
and health of bosses if you're playing with somebody else,
Yes.
but not by enough that makes
No.
significant enough difference that having somebody else there is like a huge aid.
Or having someone
Um,
else there is always a good thing in these games. It
yeah,
doesn't really matter. There's I can think of maybe one or two bosses in Bloodborne where that's not the case, where actually it is a lot easier to fight them on your own, but they are few and far between. Few and far between. Lady Maria, you've got to fight her on your own.
yeah,
Just to get
yeah.
the feeling of that fight, you need to fight her on your own because that is probably my favourite of all of them.
It's more of a dual fight, so it
Yeah.
doesn't really work with. And there's a fight in Dark Souls 2. I'm not sure who, but they fight very much like a duelist. And yeah, fighting that person, we actually had somebody else as well with us, who was amusingly called Biggest Dickus. Great name for a character in Dark Souls,
Fantastic.
yeah.
That some of the, I must say, some of like the wider community in Dark Souls, they're so funny. Some of the character names
Yes.
are amazing. What was the one I came across? Oh, there's some amazing ones. You know, Prince Harming was one I came across. Prince Harming, which I thought was awesome.
I like reading all the signs on the floor and just how many of them are nonsense.
Most of them are complete like jokey nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. One of them was go forwards backwards that I read recently.
Whenever you
Which,
get,
yeah.
you know, the bit in Anor Londo where Guinevere appears, they always put something like magnificent chest here,
Yes,
or something
yeah.
like that. Or if there's a corpse that happens to be draped over like a balustrade or something, they always put something like thrust butthole or something
They're
like that.
not very sophisticated jokes.
No, but very funny. I must admit, they make me titter. My favourite one of all time is one that has been, you know, in Bloodborne when you go down into the sewer and there's the pig at the end of the tunnel. There's been a marker there since the very earliest incarnations of the game, which is Fear Blobby Thing, which is just
That's
my
good.
favourite. That's my
Yeah.
favourite of all, I've got to say.
There's one, you know, the area. It's near to where that cat is on the wall. You know,
Yes.
there's a doorway to get to that cat,
Mhm.
to get to that whole garden area,
Yeah.
and you have to unlock it. And right by that doorway, there's like a pile of rubble. And there's been a marker on top of that pile of rubble forever, and it's really hard to get to.
Yes.
You've got to So I finally got up there, and it says "Praise the Sun," which I quite liked. But yeah, there's stuff like that.
There is a playfulness to the wider like Dark Souls and Bloodborne community, I find, which I really, really like. I'm not always a fan of online or video game communities. I tend to be kind of solitary when it comes to video games myself, but I do love the game playing public for Dark Souls and Bloodborne. One of the things they also do in Bloodborne, they love to try and get themselves killed in areas where you shouldn't be able to get yourself killed. So in The Hunter's Dream, where you're not supposed to be able to die, you'll find hundreds of those red ghosts where they've managed to somehow kill themselves through some feat or whatever. And I love it. I just love the fact that they bother with it. I think it's hilarious. Another one, of course, is leaving messages in places where you shouldn't be able to leave messages.
I think like controlling the interactions between the community in those ways that are highly limiting, I think often does create those more interesting communities. I mean, a good example of that would be Journey, which is all about that. Like severely limiting how you can interact with people.
Shaping positive interactions, I like that. I like that a lot.
And I guess No Man's Sky probably, I haven't really got to the sort of more community aspect, but like similarly, you know, I don't think you can talk directly to people.
No,
I
don't think so. I don't think so anyway. I mean, it certainly wasn't the case back when it first came out, but of course, Back when it first came out, we discovered that the so-called multiplayer functions didn't really exist, not in the way that was advertised. I think it is more as was advertised now, in the sense that you can go onto a server, and there will be like multiple different players on multiple different worlds throughout your universe, and you can potentially go and meet them and interact with them and stuff like that. It wasn't that way when it originally came out. It wasn't that way at all.
I think there's like I gather there's trading mechanics, or I might have misunderstood that. And there's definitely potential for fighting in the game, which I'm not that interested in. Like spaceship fighting is not
the dog fighting. Yeah. It reminded me so much. I mean, again, this is from the original incarnation of the game, so I don't know what it's like now. But back then, it reminded me of the Wing Commander series. That old FMV game that starred Mark Hamill and alien lions that looked like they were made by the Jim Henson studio.
I think I played a demo of that when I was a kid, but I didn't get the full game. A lot of games I sort of only played the demo of. Some of them I played the demo of over and over again.
Yes.
Which,
it's what you had, isn't it? We all did that, of course. I mean, it's what you had, so that's what you did, you know. I remember my first computer, the Commodore Amiga, I think one of the first games I ever played on it was a demo. And that's what you did. Especially since video games are expensive.
First level. Yeah. I mean, you could like stitch together quite a lot of gameplay because they gave you the whole first level usually in the demo. So yeah, and as a kid, you don't really care that much. And the stories of these games were never sophisticated anyway. They weren't
there was no space, was there? There was no space for story or anything like that. If you got a story, it was largely like in text at the beginning of the game, maybe if you were lucky. Or it was in the manual.
Yes.
It was a little paragraph in the manual, and that was it.
Which were never that interesting.
No, they were just excuses for the games to exist, and that was largely it. I mean, to be fair, why did you need a narrative for a Super Mario game? I mean, in what world would it even make sense for there to be a narrative? That said, there was a Super Mario RPG, you know, towards the end of the Super Nintendo.
I hadn't heard of that.
It's really good. It's shockingly good. It's shockingly good. What they've managed to do is maintain, you know, that sort of whimsiness that the Mario games have, where nothing is terribly serious, there's no grand stakes or anything like that. They've maintained that in the RPG, and even somehow managed to maintain the jumping and platform mechanics, despite the fact that it's an isometric, old-fashioned RPG. It's very good. Super Mario RPG is what it's called. The Legend of the Seven Stars, I think, is its subtitle. It's good. It's not bad at all. It's shockingly good, actually, and people have been calling for a direct sequel to that for a long time.
They have a tendency of not delivering directly to fans. That studio. So,
to be fair, part of the problem with Super Mario RPG is that it was the last game created for the Super Nintendo by Squaresoft when it was still Squaresoft, and of course, directly after that, Square and Nintendo fell out. So it's probably that. It's probably copyright license. It's probably that. Great shame, really. Great shame. But it's a very decent piece of work, and it pushes the Super Nintendo to its utmost in terms of what it does. It's a technically very impressive piece of work. I would highly recommend watching a Let's Play of that one, or getting it on an emulator if you can.
Yeah, I might sort of see what's around. I've never been a console player, so a lot of these, like, I was always sort of PC.
Right, so a lot of the
console thing.
The sort of JRPGs that were very big on the consoles may have passed you by.
Yeah, I never got into Persona or anything like that.
Or even earlier, the things like the original Final Fantasy games and...
Yes, I haven't actually played a single... your Let's Play of the Final Fantasy game is probably like the most contact I've had with Final Fantasy.
Right. So
I should watch Jack Graham's series of, I think they're Patreon.
Yes.
Because I might learn a thing or two about the Final Fantasy games.
It's trying to explain Final Fantasy VII to a layperson is the funniest thing you can attempt to do, because it doesn't. It's a JRPG, and JRPGs are massively influenced by things like anime and by certain conventions of Japanese storytelling, and trying to explain them to a layperson is nigh impossible.
I know enough about anime to know what that would be like. Like describing the entire plot of Naruto to somebody who's never seen an anime before would be interesting.
You sound like a babbling crazy person when you do it.
Yes. Yeah. And then the snake guy wants to steal the child's body so that he has the eye power.
But it makes sense. It makes sense. You know, you've got to keep making that caveat. You've got to keep explaining. But it makes sense. You've got to watch it. You've got to make it make sense. Yeah, I mean, I've been trying to get some friends of mine to watch some of the anime I really, really appreciate, but they don't really have a background in anime, and they've been watching a lot of the stuff that's just available on Netflix, and they're like, they don't like it. They don't like it.
Not a good way in. Like, no. A better way in is like probably something niche and narrative that's like honed to their current interests, like. If they're like long-running, complex, multivariant stories, something like Baccano, where like there's a lot of chronological stuff and there's enough substance there to get into the conventions, but the conventions are still visibly there.
Yes, I mean, some of the things, it's as I've been explaining to them, sometimes you've just got to allow for certain things. Like, it's a Japanese storytelling convention that characters exposit wildly.
Yes. Yeah.
You just can't get away from that. That whole sort of westernized thing of show don't tell, which is problematic in and of itself, just doesn't exist in Japanese storytelling tradition. In fact, the opposite exists. Characters just talk about things, often in mid-duel or action scene or whatever. And you've just got to allow for that in anime. You've just got to allow for it because that's what's going to happen.
Yeah, it's like one of the primary ways that narrative is actually delivered. So, like, expository sequences are how you learn about most characters and what motivates them. And yeah, it exists complete. I mean, even like animation from the West just doesn't have that at all.
No, it doesn't. There's massive interiority in in a lot of anime series, and a lot of anime series are actually comprised of it. I mean, Death Note is just that, isn't it? It is characters sitting around talking about what they're going to do, often to themselves. You know, there are entire scenes where Light Yagami is sat at his desk saying, "I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that and this is how I'm going to do it." And if you can't get past that, you're not going to enjoy it.
No, I guess if you were sort of watching it and not getting sucked into the conventions at all, it would just seem like this weird bunch of people just planning constantly.
Yes. And I can, I can understand how that's problematic. I really can. If it's not your bag and if you can't get past it, then you might find it really problematic or often risible, you know?
Yeah. And it's why that stuff is so difficult, of course, to adapt. Like, I mean, obviously the Death Note adaptation is famously bad.
Jesus.
Actually, both of them. I actually kind of have a soft spot for the Japanese live-action adaptations, not because I think they're good, but some of them are genuinely funny.
Because they're funny,
There's L Changed the World is, I would rank it alongside the like Evil Dead films as just being hilariously bad. Have you seen L Changed the World?
I haven't, no. I tend to avoid the live action adaptations of anime.
I would recommend that one. It's got a death sequence, so that this character contracts a disease. He's a scientist and he's behind this glass wall. And I think his daughter's on the other side. L's there. L does the exact posture of L from the anime, but as an actual human being. So he walks around in that weird, slunky way, and it is so ridiculous and almost like cute in how much they're trying to channel this.
It's weird, isn't it? I mean, there was a Full Metal Alchemist live action adaptation, and some anime I could see how you could get away with. Like Death Note, I can so see how you could do a decent live-action version of that. Because even with characters like Ryuk, it's actually largely pedestrian, isn't it? It's set in the real world. There's nothing that immense or grand that happens, you can get away with rendering it in real life terms or live action terms. Something like Full Metal Alchemist, which is so stylized, where there is so much that's magical and mystical and bravura and bizarre happening. I just don't see. I don't see the point. I just don't see the point. It's rendered in animation for a reason, you know. But also, it's so ambitious to do in live action. I just don't see why you would bother.
I mean, it's ambitious unless it's done badly, as I think both that and the Bleach adaptation.
Well, the problem with the Full Metal Alchemist,
over the top.
The problem with the Full Metal Alchemist one is it doesn't do what a good live action adaptation would do, which is take the story and the characters and adapt it for live action. It just tries to recreate it, but it's like it's a cartoon. It's animation.
When you do that directly is just silly. Unless you're consciously going for silly.
Right. It just doesn't work.
There are also like musicals. So like there are musicals of Naruto and Bleach and stuff. They are, you can catch bits of them on YouTube and they are very funny as well.
I can imagine they
just
are.
Like they're done very earnestly, which of course is what makes something perfectly funny. Like that's always like the best thing.
Yes.
I mean, like some things can like mirror that. I mean, the Evil Dead, I mentioned them. I don't think that they were that serious, but I think that they affected a certain earnestness in order to make themselves funny.
Yeah, definitely.
And that comes out brilliantly, of course, in the Evil Dead series,
which is magnificent. It's just magnificent. It treads that very fine line, doesn't it? That you get in the Evil Dead 2, of course, where it has just enough of narrative weight and just enough of the horror to make it interesting, but it's also absurdly funny.
Yeah. I mean, I love all the throwbacks and stuff. Like the bits with his car are just absolutely, like, you could just watch those over and over
and it's
again.
It's Bruce Campbell, isn't it? It's just Bruce Campbell being very aware of himself in this role.
Yes.
And somehow they play into that and make it work. It doesn't come off as obnoxious or overbearing. It just works.
I like at the end when he huge spoilers. I assume
I've seen it. Yeah.
But I like at the end when he wakes up in that sarcophagus. And they're obviously like playing on Doom.
Yeah.
Because he wakes up in exactly the way the Doom Marine wakes up. And there's this wonderful meta quality to him waking up in the future exactly like the Doom Marine because of how much the Doom Marine has now taken from Evil Dead and then vice versa. So there's this kind of like bound upness between the two franchises.
There's this strange, almost feedback loop of inspiration going on, isn't there? It's very weird. Very weird, but I kind of love it.
Yeah. And I mean, the ending fight was good. With the tank, I mean, it's just just so perfectly over
the set pieces. The set pieces are the most gloriously grotesque and brilliant things. I mean, I believe there's a fight at one point in a sperm bank.
Yes,
that
and they
made me howl.
Yes, they're throwing sperm. But in like weird icicle forms or something. It's very strange. It doesn't. They don't even try to make it make sense. But the gross outs are just incredible. I mean, the worst one, I guess, well, worst and best, was the one where with the corpse with the book inside it.
Oh God!
And he has to extract the book. And doesn't go quite as well as he hoped.
No, it does not. But it's brilliant, isn't it? I've got a soft spot. I've got a soft spot for that series.
You got to admire Bruce Campbell just being up for it all. Like, it's just brilliant. Yeah.
Well, that seems to be his milieu, really. I mean, have you listened to any of the commentaries from the original Evil Dead films?
No, I haven't actually. I should.
It's a tapestry of Bruce Campbell being basically bullied and abused by Sam Raimi. Because obviously those films don't have budgets for stunt people.
Yeah.
Obviously. So it's Bruce Campbell doing all of his own stunts and whatnot. You know the scene in Evil Dead 2 where his hand gets possessed, and
Yeah.
it's essentially horror slapstick where he's smashing plates over his head, and at one point he grasps his own hair and flips himself over. There's no editing in that shot.
Wow, he actually did that.
It's Bruce Campbell
That's...
smashing his own face in, essentially, flipping himself over. Yeah, he hurt himself really badly quite a lot on that shoot.
I can imagine that, yeah. I mean, there's some pretty wild stunts in the third one, which is... That's such a weird movie.
Army of Darkness.
Yes, yeah, the little mini ones who attack, mini versions of himself who attack him in the windmill.
What is
the windmill?
that?
Like, it's also like there seems to be a reason for things happening, but you're never given any of the reasons.
You get the impression that maybe the script was much bigger than what they managed to get into the film, ultimately. I believe there was a lot more going on with Evil Ash and where Evil Ash came from and so on and so forth. But that just got cut. It just never got into the film. So it is this weird, disjointed, slightly nightmarish story.
And I love like the weirdness of all the references in it. Like it's Arthur's castle in a desert for some reason.
In the desert for some reason, yes. Yeah. Let's not question that. Let's not question that. The Three Stooges stuff that comes up all the way through.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just balmy. It's bonkers, but you allow for it.
Yeah.
I think it's because the film is in such good fun, isn't it? It's in such good faith that you don't care. Continuity, who gives a toss? It's funny. It's a friendly film, isn't it?
Yes, it's just spectacularly what it is. Like, there's nothing else quite like it as well. Like, none of the other sort of big gore 80s movies are similar in tone or ethos or style. I don't think anyone's even really tried to replicate it, at least not that I've seen.
I don't know how you even would. It's so its own thing. It's so its own thing. And I don't think, a lot of studios, if you brought a script like that to them, they'd just say, you're having a laugh, aren't you?
Which, to be fair.
Yeah. How would you even market it? I mean, the only reason it ever got made is because, of course, Sam Raimi had such incredible clout at that time,
I gathered that he got small business owners to fund the first one. And they've actually become quite well off.
Yes, the original Evil Dead was an indie film. Essentially, they were all. I mean, it makes you sick. They were all 19, 20, 21, and they went around to people like doctors and dentists and just got them to put in $200, $500 as investors, and it made all the investors quite a lot of money because it did very well on VHS. Very well, even here in the UK where it was banned.
Yeah, it was one of the original video nasties, wasn't it?
It was, and we were very lucky when I was a kid because we got it before it was on the banned list, so we had the Evil Dead on VHS. And even as a kid watching it, I couldn't articulate it, but I was like, why? I think
there was a Tory MP who said that it was directly responsible for violence and all the violence happening in the country. They specifically pointed the finger at Evil Dead.
Yeah, right.
I mean, they don't even try to make sense. And I think those people live in this sort of nightmare world of threats from every corner that they hype themselves into believing the absurdities.
Clearly. I mean, don't get me wrong, the original Evil Dead is much more a horror film than any of the others. It's got much more of a horrific tone. But there does come a point where it is so ridiculous, it's so over the top that you get it. As the audience, you're sophisticated enough to understand, okay, this is a giant horror cartoon. It's going to try and gross me out. It's going to try and make me go oof at the screen and make me laugh. That's what it's for. There's no way the violence in The Evil Dead is in any way emulatable.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, it's clear that they didn't quite achieve what they set out to because, of course, they essentially remade it in Evil Dead 2. Although I do love how the series references both films without, any sense that they contradict each other, which they clearly do.
I love it!
So, there's these two rival narratives that are somehow both true for Ash's past.
But Bruce Campbell's always said, he says on the commentary for The Evil Dead 2, you know what, you can regard it any way you like, the way those films are set up. Is Ash stupid enough to go back to the cabin? Yeah, he is. So, whatever,
That is plausible, to be fair, to the character.
It really is, isn't it?
I like how it's left ambiguous in the series as well, whether the third one even happened, except towards the end of the series where they start more strongly leading into that it did.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the biggest indication that it happened is that they refer to the zombies as deadites, which of course isn't in the second and first film.
Yeah, they're not really anything in the first and second film, are they? They're not defined at that point. They're just the products of the Force.
Kind of, because the adversary is evil as such.
Yes.
Which, a ridiculous notion, but then, Joss Whedon literally did it in the ending of Buffy, so I guess you can kind of get away with just making your enemy evil.
It's fine,
even outside of comedy.
It serves its purpose, doesn't it,
Yeah. Yeah.
I love the way they manifest it in certainly the first and the second Evil Dead, where it is just a camera bolted to a bit of plywood and someone running through the forest with it.
Yes,
that's essentially what it is.
Motorcycle noise going on behind it.
It's really effective. It is quite scary and threatening and works. And the fact that you don't see what it is and it's heading towards where the characters are, it's quite clever, actually. There's some damn good camera work going on there.
No, it works in its way, especially for the kind of tone that they've got. I like that they don't actually show you it in the series either. That there's this, because they clearly see something.
Yeah.
But you never get to experience what
evil
looks
like.
No.
Yeah. There's never a manifestation of the evil. I think it does manifest at the end of The Evil Dead 2, doesn't it? You've got the big head that comes through the door.
I think that, I guess I was never sure if that was the camera perspective or just a manifestation of one of the demons.
Right. I was never clear on that. All I know is that in the production notes it's called the Rotten Apple Head. That's all I know.
Yes.
Apt is what it looks like, definitely. Oh man, I enjoy those films. I've got real sentimental attachments to those films. I remember watching The Evil Dead 1 when I was a kid on VHS and very much enjoying it.
No, I think I saw it quite later, as a sort of older teenager first time, and I had no idea what it was at that point. And I was on the floor laughing. This is Evil Dead 2. And I wasn't sure, if it was meant seriously when I was seeing it. So it's just what is this?
What is it? Yeah, because Evil Dead 2 is anarchic.
Yes.
The minute you get into the cabin, that's it. All structure, everything just blows apart, and all it is these brilliant horror set pieces.
Yeah. I mean, it's actually wonderfully sort of I'm searching for a word, carnivalesque. It's I mean, with the laughing furniture and stuff like that. Yeah.
Henrietta in the basement.
Yes. Yeah. The dancing corpse of his girlfriend. The first thing she does when she resurrects as a deadite is dance around.
Yeah.
And it's weirdly done in this eerie way with a clear plasticine model or something.
Stop motion animation. Love it. Love it to bits. There's that brilliant bit where he's Ash. It recreates the end of the original film where the Force picks up Ash and hurtles him through the woods, and he's clearly strapped to some sort of mechanism that's carrying him through the woods, and that's what they did. It is actually Bruce Campbell on this basically crucified on this big metal cross. And
wonder he hasn't been killed in
right. It is crazy the amount of stuff he goes through on that shoot. It's absolutely crazy. But he's actually made a bit of a reputation for himself in Hollywood for doing exactly that. For being a kind of actor come stuntman.
Yes, yeah. I mean, some of the stuff he's done, like the littler things he's done, are really interesting. Have you seen a series called Southern Gothic? I think it is, or American? No, not American Gothic. That's
American
the
Gothic I saw.
is the
That was
big one.
in
Yeah,
American Gothic was the one I'm thinking of was a show in the
yeah.
1990s.
Yes, yes. American Gothic. That's it. Yeah, it's like 12 episodes, and it got cancelled, and it's got a mayor who's like a Mephistophelian
That's
figure.
right. Yes,
Yeah,
he's the
and Bruce
sheriff. Yeah,
Campbell.
the
Yeah,
sheriff.
and
Yeah.
Bruce Campbell comes at the end. He's like one of the. I think he's kind of half hunting this guy,
Yes.
but he's also not very competent.
The
Um,
implication is that like the sheriff is the devil,
yeah,
sort of.
and the main character is his son.
Yes, that's
But
right.
I think
Lucas Buck.
kind of like
Lucas
yeah,
Buck is his name. Yeah, God Almighty, I
yeah.
haven't thought about
Oh
that.
yes,
For
the buck stops here. That's
yeah,
the trade line. I mean, it's hammy as anything,
yeah.
but it's really fun. And
Yeah.
completely genred in like this apt way. Like it's got that whole like the careful what you wish for
Yeah,
motif.
there's a Stephen King element to it.
Yeah,
It kind of echoes
yeah,
Needful Things and that kind of thing.
absolutely.
I
Yeah,
remember
and
watching that when I was a kid. God Almighty.
I mean, it was really badly done too because they showed it apparently in the wrong order when it went on
Oh.
television, and then when you get the DVDs, it's still in that incorrect order. So you've got to go online when you get the DVD, and no one gets DVDs anymore.
No, of
You got to
course.
go online and you got to work out the ordering of the episode in order to watch it sequentially.
Oh, that sucks. That is such a shame because
Yeah,
it was actually, I mean, for all of its fault, it was actually a narrative. So you had like
yes.
escalating situations, and I can't even remember what the name of the town was, some little American town. Um, there was actually a
It kind of
narrative, wasn't there?
it falls apart a little towards the end,
Yeah.
unfortunately, around when Bruce Campbell appears, although he
Yes.
does a good job as usual. And I think they kind of just ran out of where they were going.
Yeah.
But it did have a narrative arc to it, and it mostly works. I mean, there's kind of bits of it that are a bit Garth Marenghi's Dark Place, I guess. Like very much in that vein.
Yeah.
Although even those bits are charming for the exact same reason that Garth Marenghi's Dark Place works. And but the bits that work well, especially the first 4 or 5 episodes, which are quite sinister and interesting, and there's like a sense of more going on.
Yeah.
It's a good series. I would still recommend it.
I remember enjoying it very much when I was a kid. I remember it being quite strange because, of course, that kind of situation where you've got supernatural elements bled into a seemingly real situation are kind of 10 a penny now, but they were not that common at that time.
No. I mean, that's why like X-Files was such a big thing.
Oh,
Because
wow.
its ability to like blend those. I mean, now of course there's so many X-Files type
Yes.
derivatives. I think there's like a new one every week on Netflix.
Definitely.
Like,
And the original
Monster,
X-Files, I mean, have you gone back and tried to watch it?
oh, I mean, it's
Doesn't work, does it?
no. I mean, like there are particular episodes that I think have stood the test of time, but they are particular episodes.
Yes.
The overall narrative arc is a bit loopy, and I think has sadly lent itself to a kind of reactionary reading of the show a little bit because it's very much like conspiracy theories are true.
A friend of mine
which,
on Twitter actually put it like, do you remember a more innocent time in like the mid 1990s when conspiracy theories were a bit of fun and you could sort of get into the culture of them without getting into the reactionary politics behind them?
I mean, like nowadays, it would be hard to imagine like 3 nerds who are into anti-government conspiracy theories who aren't also like anti-Semitic alt-righters, like complaining about the trans agenda on Twitter.
It's so sad, isn't it? Because there's I've always been into things like occultism and the narrative of conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. Not in terms of believing them, but in terms of what they represent on a narrative, a mythological level. I've always kind of enjoyed that, but it's difficult to do that when there's so much that's bound up with things like anti-Semitism and racism and
I mean, when people start to lean into those as a substitute for politics in fact, like that's and I mean, I think the X-Files is weird because I think it came out of a period where a lot of the tropes come out of a period where people were leaning into that, like in the early 80s and such.
Of course, of course.
But it was at a period where that had stopped meaning anything.
Yeah.
So it was a kind of nostalgia version of that conspiracy.
Yes.
And now it's kind of entered into a period where all of that stuff has its more sinister aspects again.
Yeah.
So it kind of existed in, I mean, it's the 90s, this weird interlude in history where history seemed kind of suspended.
Just to stop. To stop.
Like,
there's nothing that defines the 90s, is there?
Yeah. Except this sort of sense of absence and kind of mediocre liberal progression. Like, the future was going to be better and everywhere was going to be the same. But that's it. Like, just in this, like, very one-dimensional way, things will be better. And then, of course, 2008 somewhat popped that delusion. Although, not for everybody. I mean, there's still the die-hard Clintonites and Blairites who are just waiting for the return of normality.
Don't we know it? Don't we know
they always frame it in terms of maturity. Like, the issue was, of course, that all the adults left the room. And, why they would do something so incredibly frivolous as the adults, I'm not sure. Like these are incredibly mature people, but they all just decided to just get up and leave for some reason. And we're just waiting for them to return. The Starmerites right now, I guess, are very much of that. And it's a desperate. I think almost all politics now is nostalgia in a way. Like even on the radical left, I think there's like a tendency for nostalgia for the 1970s.
Yeah.
And on the sort of soft dem left, there's like the 1950s. We'll just bring back the post-war consensus.
It's something that bothers me enormously. I've got to say, it bothers me enormously because it seems to me, in order to even begin to approach the myriad problems we're facing right now, culturally, politically, on a global level, we need looking forward. We need some sort of utopian ideals, really, and we're not getting that.
The organisational basis for that is just absent, I think, in a profound way. And I think, well, it's not quite as toxic as outright conspiracy, which is also kind of a form of nostalgia politics stuff. It often harks back to a kind of primordial mythic
absolutely. Well, it is in many respects. If you look at things like in the 1990s, you had the whole narrative coming of like alien abductions. That was one of the big ones, wasn't it? That was very, very popular in the 1990s. It is essentially a recurrence of stories of people being bewitched by sorcerers or whatever, or possessed by demons or whatever.
They are very archetypal, actually, and although I don't quite adhere to Jung's ideas, it is interesting that him as the psychologist of archetypes and mythology was one of the few psychoanalysts to take UFO abductions seriously. So he wrote an entire book on it, and he actually studied the phenomenon. And I think that's probably because he took mythology seriously.
So incredibly seriously, yes.
Yeah. And I mean, I think I have different views to him because I think he has a very ahistorical reading of these things. And I think there is a potential for a sort of more Marxist interpretation of those phenomena, but I think there is something to seeing these things in mythological terms.
Definitely. There is definitely some value there. They definitely serve or reflect some consistent element of humanity and the structures that we've made. And I'm sure if you looked at it, there would be some consistency in the situations in which they occur.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think the alien abduction myths in the 90s, and them always happening in these sort of slightly wealthier rural places, I think it was on the whole. And it's obviously a response to just the tedium of that life that was largely lived in those places. You're in the periphery, but you're not really struggling with anything.
Yeah.
So life is kind of just this really seamless greyness that just stretches on forever. So of course you want like aliens to come and make life interesting again, make some history happen. Like you certainly don't want the aliens visiting Washington like everybody else is.
Exactly, or doing something where everyone can see that it's happening. of course,
Yes,
because
I mean that's the other side of it.
yeah, where they're visiting everyone, because it makes you special, doesn't it? You know, it feeds into a kind of internal mythology then.
Yeah. It's that sense of we're actually a part of history, and
Yeah.
I think like I mean, as much as there's a kind of 90s nostalgia in some circles, like I think there was a kind of horror of the 90s, a horror of a period without history,
Yeah.
and actually in a more profound way even than now in some senses. I think because we have a sense of hopelessness as a set against the challenges we face,
Hmm.
but I don't think I think they had a sense of hopelessness in the sense that there was never going to be a challenge again.
Right, there was this
Um,
kind of stagnation, wasn't there,
yeah,
where there was nothing that provided a kind of definition or
yeah,
identity for people. And I think that's largely where a lot of this stuff comes from. It kind of allows you to create your own homespun mythology, doesn't it?
yeah. To sort of re-inject some life into life, I guess. And
Yeah, some
yeah,
poetry, something, anything. There must be more than this grey round forever and ever and ever.
yeah. I mean, of course, that whole illusion of the 90s was sort of dependent on ignoring all the actual world
Yeah,
suffering that was going on during the 90s, including in the peripheries of the very people that were sort of besotted with this idea
true,
of
yeah.
history. But they could always explain that away by just pointing to economic bubbles and
Hmm.
seeing that there was this continuous slow climb of the economy, and yeah, and the idea that any kind of alternative to liberal democracy was essentially dead in the water because it had just won out,
Hmm.
clearly. Um, and of course, they all expect it to happen again. They expect
They want it to come round again,
yeah,
don't they? And they see, yeah, and I think you're right. There is this almost naive earnestness, isn't there, amongst a
yes,
lot of them, where they do seem to genuinely believe it's going to come round again.
because it was so much their normality
Right.
that like it still is. Like this is the aberration, and I don't think it matters how long this goes on for. It will always be the
Yeah.
aberration for those people. Like you listen to like certain like centrist politicians, like I don't know, Jess Phillips
Hmm.
talk. And I honestly don't think that she can accept that this is happening at a certain like visceral level.
Yeah.
Like that Boris Johnson is prime minister, that Donald Trump was president,
Hmm.
that the Labour Party could be taken over by a Bennite, that the left could suddenly be marching through streets again, that the far right could be marching through streets
Hmm.
again, both the ugly and the
Yeah.
good, is just incomprehensible. And so it's interpreted as this weird period of temporary madness
Hmm.
that eventually somebody who's competent is going to fix.
Yeah.
And yeah, I don't think it's going to go very well for those
I
people.
no, I
Um,
think they're going to essentially sort of shuffle off this mortal coil, being very disappointed.
yes, yeah, I think that they are in for a series of increasing shocks
Yeah.
if they don't, in fact, eventually just get forced into adapting by the extremity of the
Just by
situation.
yeah,
Yeah,
just by circumstance, where they or maybe even retreat into a state of deep denial.
yes, I mean, I think that's where they are now. I
Yeah.
mean, like Starmer's political strategy. I think someone recently described it as not just like Blair, in the sense of like 1997 Blair who won an election, but like late noughties Blair who was like hemorrhaging votes.
Yeah.
Like, and it's yeah. I mean, that's it. Like he's consciously aiming for a kind of liberal centrist law and order party that there's just no market
There's
for
no
anywhere.
call for
Yeah,
anywhere. No, it's the
yeah,
most bizarre tone deaf thing imaginable, isn't it?
yeah, and it's really kind of odd how he can exist. Like I would have thought, as bad as focus groups are, that even they would have given some indication that this is not a strategy that's viable.
Right,
I mean,
right.
I'm not quite as down on like things like polling and such that I mean I think it can be used badly,
Hmm.
including by the left. Chomsky famously uses polling badly because he
Hmm.
just like bluntly states like polling facts as if they just literally translate into holistic politics. So
Right,
like
right.
X number of people think capitalism isn't working very well, so we're just 1 inch from the anarchist revolution. Is probably not how reality works, sadly.
No, definitely not.
But like, I think you can extract useful things from it, and yeah, I don't understand how, even though the evidence that these people sort of acquire is clearly very faulty, I don't understand how they can interpret even that evidence in the ways that they clearly are, without just desperation, I guess, filling the gaps, which I guess is the answer.
Right. I mean, you
Yeah.
would have thought that just a casual daily glance at some social media platforms, or hell, just in normal circumstances, just walking around in a crowded city listening to conversation,
Yes.
might give them some indication of where public mood generally is,
Yeah.
and of the people they should be appealing to.
I mean, I think they famously don't respect the internet as a metric of opinion, which, to be fair, there are problems with doing that. But I think there's. I remember sort of. Do you remember the Ron Paul? Was it Revolution or something? His run for the presidency as a libertarian
I
candidate.
do vaguely,
Yeah,
yes,
I
I
mean that was sort
do.
of big on that like noughties era YouTube with
Hmm.
all the libertarians, and a
Yes,
lot
they
of those
were.
people ended up going like fascist.
Yeah, they went full fascist
Yeah,
in the end, didn't they?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And I think when he did that, there was like this excitement about like, oh, could you run a political campaign online?
Mm.
And I think people sort of prematurely concluded from his failure that you couldn't. But I think that missed the fact that he actually did way better than he should have done. Like he didn't succeed, palpably didn't succeed. But this was a guy whose like main platform was like to get rid of like most taxation and close the border and illegalize abortion and all this hodgepodge of like really random things. Who had like a reputation as a racist already emerging and so on and so forth. Who still got like Democrats to vote for him, like quite a sizable chunk of Democrats to like join the GOP so they could get him as the candidate.
Yeah.
And I think what hasn't happened is no one's learned this is now an effective strategy. And I think in 2017 with Jeremy Corbyn, it was shown to be an effective strategy on the left. And then I think with both Trump in every election he's run, and with Boris Johnson in 2019, where he adopted very much the same approach too. The online opinion, it doesn't translate like for like, and it's really hard to interpret because numbers are highly distorted, like on social media.
Absolutely, and also the mechanisms are very often very subversive. They're very sort of underground. So the online arenas in which gave birth to what I suppose you could call the Trump movement was not an active political campaign. It wasn't the case of these sinister cabals influencing the way people operated. It came out of certain subcultures that coalesced over a long period of time. You know, it's much more a kind of petri dish, or almost like a swamp, where you've got to look at the way subcultures naturally coalesce and operate. It's much more complex than people are willing to look at. And
I think that's generally the way. I mean, I think the left has a problem with seeing this on the right. The right, like, we tend to, I think, over-identify these things with the people who lead them. And see those people as Machiavellian geniuses. Which is
a massive problem. It's a huge problem. It's because there's a hideous defensiveness in it in many respects. It's why there's that hideous narrative that the Nazis, despite all their apparent faults, were somehow competent on economic matters and whatnot, when they weren't. When you bother to look at it, they weren't.
They adopted, I mean, the Nazis in particular adopted some Keynesian measures when a sort of moribund Germany was unwilling to with the other parties. And that worked to a point, but it actually had the seeds of its doom built into it, because war Keynesianism sort of has to go to war. And, and it was eventually a war on every front. I mean, I'm not saying like there was like some predeterminedness to the Second World War that the Nazis couldn't have wreaked even more devastation than they did, and that was certainly sufficient to be pretty damn horrifying. But they did have a certain element of sort of doom written into them, in terms of, and I think fascism always does.
Yeah.
It's not really like, I think it's consciously a project designed to do what it says it's going to do, but in reality, it can only really either restore capitalist hegemony or actually absolutely destroy everything.
Yeah.
Like, that's really the only path it's got. As an ideology. I don't think it could cohere into anything meaningful and lasting.
No, certainly not lasting.
However horrifying. No. Yeah. I mean, that was actually parodied in some sort of good, sort of pre-Second World War anti-Nazi satires, like Swastika Night by Catherine Burdekin. It's mostly an exploration of sort of Nazi misogyny.
Right.
But one of the things that novel does is it like takes seriously the claim of the 1,000-year Reich, and actually like situates this like after 1,000 years of Nazism.
Wow.
And the whole of society has sort of like degenerated under these unlivable conditions where even like people in the upper tiers of the Nazi party can't really flourish as human beings, given just the extent of the ideology of purity and such.
Right.
And women have been reduced to a level where they're essentially unable to even speak. They're essentially farmed. But they increasingly don't produce any offspring. And, you know, men loathe the women because this whole society is based on misogyny as well as sort of racial violence.
Of course.
And I don't think it's like meant to be read literally. I think it's, you know, what Burdekin was doing was she's just like saying, just look how absurd Nazi ideology is taken to
a logical extreme. Yeah.
And yeah, I think you can go interestingly in other ways, like Man in the High Castle, in that sense of like the banality of dystopia. I think that's I don't think anyone else has really done that as effectively. Like the horror of the dystopia being the continuation of normality.
That's it, isn't it? That is a key problem that a lot of people have, I find. Like sort of a lot of people on the ground have with the notion of dystopia. When you use the term in description of what we're living in now, they tend to believe that you're being hyperbolic. Because of the assumptions they've been conditioned with from fiction, largely from media. When in fact it is that's literally where we are. We are in the dystopian ruins of neoliberalism.
Yeah. And I think like Philip K. Dick kind of points something even more radical potentially, which is that like dystopia will never really feel like dystopia because human beings just are incapable of seeing their reality.
That's it. Terms. You can't appreciate it when you're in it, you know? It's something I was certainly thinking about with regards to the COVID situation, you know, how quickly we normalize awful things, you know, for the sake of our own sanity. Yeah.
I think afterwards we will if there is an afterwards, if we're not sort of continuously living in and out of pandemics, which is disturbingly a possibility.
A disturbing possibility, but a possibility nonetheless.
Yeah. And I don't think, given how badly we've handled this and given what else is on the horizon, it doesn't bode well.
Not for the UK, it doesn't. Not for the UK, it doesn't.
But it's... But yeah, I mean, I think what will happen if we do get past this particular phase is we'll hyper-mythologize it.
Of course,
And we'll it will become strange again.
Yeah, give it 10 years.
It strange retrospectively.
That's right, give it 10 years. Give it 10 years when there are school children who were not alive.
Yeah.
Then that's when it will become a narrative. That's when you'll get it in textbooks and whatnot, and there will be sociological courses exploring the effects of COVID on a cultural level and a psychological level, and so on and so forth. And that's when the myths will start to come out.
Yeah. And distortions, almost certainly, including grand political distortions. I mean, the 1970s famously get this kind of treatment, I think.
And the 60s, my God. My God, do they get the treatment? I mean, it is essentially, the 60s are a period, now certainly the USA, 1960s, the myth is now far more prominent and significant than any notion of a historical reality.
I think it's because the problematics and the sort of projects that were set up there was sort of so profoundly stillborn in terms of their sort of ability to go forward, but still kind of meet up with a lot of what we find difficult today.
Yeah.
That we're kind of, there's almost a sense of, have you seen the series? Oh, it's a superhero series. I'm mixed views on it generally. It's like a comedy one. Lots of time travel. I can't remember the name of it. It's from a comic book, which is allegedly a lot better. Oh, it's about a series of siblings, and they're all superheroes. And they Umbrella Academy.
No, I've had it recommended to me, but I haven't sat down and watched it.
Season 1 is quite good, but season 2 is fascinating because they go into the 60s, and it strikes me as being just this kind of liberal pathology of trying to deal with the 60s without being able to deal with it. So they throw everything at you. They throw the conspiracy theories, the politics, the movements, the the Black rights movement, the LGBTQ movement that was emerging,
the drug culture,
the drug
all that
culture,
kind
everything.
of thing.
Yeah, the cults. But what's amazing is they say nothing about any of this.
There's no commentary.
Everything. Yeah. And I think that that absence of commentary just seems to be not so much like an unwillingness to say something, but an inability.
Yeah.
They don't know what to say about all of this material. They clearly find it entrancing and somehow contemporaneously relevant, and I think it is both of those things. But it's so muddled and so there's so much pathos about its failure, really. I think that's what comes through most of all, that they can't really even psychologically bear to say anything about it. I think about it would be actually painful.
Yes, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, if you read sort of like the young poets who were from the US from that period, and the writers, people like Hunter S. Thompson, for example, there is this profound despair because the youth movements of that time and place, they talk about things like Vietnam, for example, being the last war. Being the last great war that anyone will ever fight, about the establishment and tradition coming down around them. And they seem to feel, as Hunter S. Thompson himself actually says, they feel as though their energy will prevail. They don't actually have to do anything direct. Just by being and operating in the way they do, they'll prevail over the forces of old and evil.
Yes, yeah. There's that fantastic line in Fear and Loathing, the high watermark. Yeah, the high watermark. I mean, that's actually, that film is much more nihilistic, and the book, of course, is much more nihilistic than it superficially seems.
Oh my God, yeah. Well, it's a regret, isn't it? Yeah. I mean, the Hunter S. Thompson character in the film certainly is he's out of his time.
Yes.
He's a child of the 60s, and the 60s are dead. The world that he operates in is becoming increasingly buttoned down, authoritarian, and counterposed to every ideal that he lives by and represents.
I mean, it's Don Quixote in a sense. I mean, of course, the guy who directed the film,
Terry Gilliam.
Yeah, Terry Gilliam. I mean, he famously just remakes Don Quixote
over and over again.
Yes, just Don Quixote in some form. So it always has the formula of two or more, but usually two outlandish protagonists, one of whom is sort of leading the way, who is in a fantasy, the other of whom is supporting him in the fantasy.
Yeah.
Sometimes, like, there's direct tropes, like, even in Brazil, I think there's like a knight fighting a dragon and stuff, and the dragon is not really a dragon, so, like, it's not even subtle. But what's fantastic about him taking on that is I think he just inherently recognized that Hunter S. Thompson's book is Don Quixote. It's a Don Quixote story. And I think just that recognition is really fascinating because it has the pathos of Don Quixote. It has that sense of tragedy that Don Quixote has, a kind of warped, absurd tragedy.
Yeah.
It's a deeply sad period because I think, again, it's an organizational failure to some extent. In the 60s, there was a belief, I think, that, as you say, like, energy could prevail, that there was a kind of almost spiritual way out of these structures and these positions of power,
Just by operating outside of them, by running away, that just by not being the youth cultures not being part of their parents' worlds, that would somehow cause them to collapse.
And I think what they discovered, of course, is that these systems are actually so profoundly able to absorb everything.
Yeah.
And that's like, that's a more catastrophic death in a way than just being defeated, to being so completely absorbed that you no longer can tell apart your project from just broader society, except you haven't changed broader society.
Well, of course, famously, or most of those children of the 60s, the flower children, the people who were believed in things like free love and so on and so forth, ultimately became the most authoritarian capitalists and neoliberals you could possibly imagine. Yeah. They became the fathers and mothers of neoliberalism.
I mean, there's a thing in France, I gather, of like, at least there was when it's sort of generationally matched up, of like famous politicians claiming to have, across the whole political spectrum, claiming to have been participants in 1968. And that's, just a desperately sad thing to hear, like to get that sense of the betrayal of that project.
Yeah.
And the mediocrity that follows from it. And I mean, like, it's hard to really get beyond that as a project. I mean, I think you have to look away from all of these kinds of nostalgias, really. Like, there's no correct interpretation.
You fall into the trap of trying to emulate them, don't you?
Yes.
Out of some idealized notion of what they were. I mean, I can fall into this trap as easily as anyone. I find the sort of flower child hippie Age of Aquarius movement from the 1960s to be aesthetically really appealing on a number of levels, but I also know that it was also a situation of hideous mass rape and drug abuse, and obviously serial killers were very, very active in the 1960s. Because
sorry, go on.
No, go on.
I mean, I was going to say, I think more generally it was just that failure to have an actual project, because it was so based on this idea that you could just will yourself into a better world. And I mean, I think that was because there wasn't really an analysis of power that sort of undergirded any of that.
Also, I mean, there was just a profound disaffection as well. I mean, the youth movements of that era, very much like the youth movements now, to be perfectly honest, was so powerfully out of love with the systems and traditions they'd been born into that they just wholesalely rejected them. Yeah. I just refused to participate in them at all.
And the other side for that is, for better or worse, those systems were able to adapt. I mean, I think the 1950s model was, I mean, largely, of course, it's glossed over by mythology and distorted now. But it wasn't a livable situation, even for those people who were sort of quote-unquote flourishing. It was, so repressive and so misogynistic and so limiting in terms of the scope of somebody's self-realization and identity. And it, these capitalist regimes, Britain, America, etc., they just dropped a lot of that. They allowed a greater scope for people to be different and varied and such. And there's kind of a move in the opposite direction now, but I don't think it's quite a return to the 1950s. I think it's a weirder, more sort of obscene reactionary movement that actually has this strange scope for diversity, but in its own very narrow and distorting terms.
Well, you see that in microcosms, don't you? I mean, you saw it recently with the attacks on Pride, for example, where you had people from heteronormative, cisgender quarters trying to curtail what Pride, or to prescribe what Pride should be about based on their tastes.
Yes.
And their desires. And of course, I know it's probably not helpful, but my reaction to that is, go fuck yourselves.
I think it's actually the most mature reaction, because I think, like, there's that stuff which comes from, like, the sort of progressive, sort of more social democratic cultures of sort of the respectable left, the left that wants progressivism to sort of wear a mature face, to kind of adopt some of that 90s aesthetic. And that's, I mean, like, as much as, I mean, in its very attempt to grasp for maturity, I think it's a profoundly immature ideology, and it's ultimately self-debasing and self-defeating. Like, those people, probably the best thing you can do for them is to shock them out of that complacent respectability.
Absolutely.
Because they won't achieve their ends.
No, I mean, part of the problem, of course, is just the natural assumption that this area, this arena, this phenomena that is ours, it's one of the few spaces we legitimately have that is not in some way prescribed by heteronormative cisgender culture, should be curtailed in the name of what they assume their children want. Or, I mean, the obvious response is, well, don't bring your kids then.
Yeah. I just don't buy that it's really about kids.
It's not. No, it's not. I mean, it's the same cant, isn't it? It's always the same. Yeah. It's the same language you get from any kind of moral reaction where they're trying to wedge their ways in.
Yes.
It's always think of the children. It's always think of the children, regardless of what it is.
They're really appealing to an imaginary adult,
yes.
Kind of like an imaginary parental figure who's austere and serious and needs that reflected back to them in every aspect of society, or they won't be given good things.
Right.
Sort of tidy your room adult.
Right. And it's also the adult who fundamentally does not understand what children are.
Yes.
Doesn't remember what children are, and has this kind of Victorian idealized notion of just storybook concept of children, which is non-compatible with reality and is actually in and of itself, ironically, very, very damaging.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like, they don't... It's not really, as I say, reflective of... And as you say, it's not reflective of children at all. They don't really, I think, sincerely even mean the arguments that they say.
No, I don't either. It's bad faith.
Bad faith.
It's enormously bad faith. It is a wedge issue by which they can gain control.
Yeah.
That's
their discomfort precedes their arguments.
Yeah.
And their arguments are just ways of channeling that discomfort.
Well, you can see that that's the truth when you look at the nature of heteronormative culture in and of itself. As I said to Jack Graham when we discussed this on a podcast, heteronormative culture is a whorehouse. It doesn't see it, but it is.
Like, because all culture is fascinated by sexuality and such. It's just that some of it serves or can be made to serve existing structures of power, and some of it can't,
and it's so normalized. Some of it is so normalized that you just don't see it. It's a normalized thing. So if it is sort of like a male gazy perspective of a woman's body, it can be anywhere. It can be absolutely anywhere. It can be adverts that are in between children's programs on television. It can be used to advertise cars and chocolate and whatever. I mean, I use chocolate adverts as an example. Think of any random chocolate advert, certainly flake adverts, from since the 1960s onwards. They use shorthand for women orgasming, always.
Yes, yeah. And you can see how prescribed it is just by changing the tiniest details. Like, it's ridiculous, and on a certain level, like, it's almost kind of like a vulgar critique because it's so frivolous, but it kind of works. I remember seeing something where they posed all the male superhero Marvel franchise characters in the poses that they had the female Marvel superhero cards, and like, it looks strange, like, even to my eye, having been sort of trained to see these things differently. But there's just nothing going on here that isn't going on in every other single poster.
Right.
Yeah, and like, it's because one set of images reaffirms a certain status quo, set of status quo ideas, and the other doesn't. Sexuality is not the point at all. Sexuality is rife across all tiers of society. And of course, people have limits to who and should or shouldn't be exposed to things, and those are, to various degrees, maintained rightly and wrongly. But the idea of this sort of sexless public space doesn't exist, and what does exist is an idea that if sex is prescribed, then it isn't sex. Like if you just keep it within those prescriptions, which are largely just reaffirming heterosexual male sexual fantasies,
Exactly.
then it's fine.
Yeah.
It's not really sexuality. And the second that you have like anything even slightly outside of that, it becomes risky.
It becomes a political
dangerous.
Statement, doesn't it? It becomes almost revolutionary by its very nature. Which, speaking as a self-identified gay man, actually lends the whole thing a kind of frisson. There's definitely that. But with regards to the attacks on Pride, it just demonstrates the sheer hypocrisy of them, doesn't it?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's this continuous history, I think, of trying to turn Pride into this commercialized,
this anodyne space, anodyne space, when it should be revolutionary by its very nature. I mean, that's actually a wider issue within LGBTQ culture. There is this heteronormalizing quality that comes along with degrees of, for want of a better term, acceptance and whatnot, where we've sort of found a way of emulating certain heteronormative phenomena like marriage, for example, which of course we should have the freedom to do if we want to, absolutely, and anything that wants to call itself society with any legitimacy, then of course we should have to. But the double-edged sword, the other edge of that, is that it kind of robs us of our teeth a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think like it's the whole thing of assimilationism and how that's handled, and also like obviously, like, no one really benefits from assimilating into a society that, on a more profound level, rejects them.
Right.
So, like, I don't think that people who, like, get sort of marriage and adoption, etc., end up perfectly content. Like, the 1990s style social boons that were given to the LGBTQ community to limited extent and obviously unevenly across those categories.
Right.
But also existing completely outside of all of those institutions is hell. And so it's completely understandable that people will assimilate, and the price of that is often jettisoning some elements of the community that are less amenable to that assimilation. Such as homeless gay people, for example, especially homeless gay youths who obviously pose a bigger problem to social reproduction under capitalism than middle-class gay people who want to marry and have children and present at least a front of being like heterosexual families as the ideal.
Absolutely. There's a sort of emulatory quality to it, isn't there? We're emulating straight culture, so we're okay. We're the anodyne gays. We're fine. We're okay. We can be accepted.
And I don't think anybody wins from that, because I think I guess the powerful win for that. The people who benefit from the maintenance of those oppressions win from it. But I don't think the people who are assimilated fully win from it either. I mean, obviously they're doing better than the people excluded, or they wouldn't have assimilated in the first place. But I think they still have to distort their humanity, and they don't have autonomy over how that's done in any way. So it's a kind of horrifying situation. I mean, that's kind of feeds back into the kind of what I was talking about in terms of the horror of the 90s. Like, that was very much what emancipation, I think, looked like in the 90s. Like, everyone just becomes the norm.
They just become the same. Kind of, you see it in things like sitcoms. You see it in a lot of American sitcoms. So towards the end of the 90s, you had things like Will and Grace, for example, which is sort of like it's the LGBTQ equivalent of a minstrel show. To my eyes, it's appalling on so many levels. But it does portray this sort of assimilated queer culture, which I really loathe. But for one thing, it's a lie. It's a total myth.
Expectations, so it's not frightening anymore. Like it gets rid of what is the sort of the other, the sort of the neighbor who is different to you, that frightens people because it challenges how they live. Like, somebody lives differently to me, then obviously I don't have to live like this, and maybe I could have lived better, and so on and so forth. And it gets rid of all of that by just making the neighbor character just another version of you.
Another version
with all
of
the same
you, right?
Anxieties and banalities, and they're gay, and so they have to follow some stereotyped sort of scripts to signal their gayness and to signal that their gayness is non-threatening.
That's it. That's it
yeah.
exactly.
But other than that, they're just like you, and that's how liberal tolerance is always framed. Like, we should tolerate people because we're all the same, and we all have the same desires, we all have the same needs, we all have the same trajectories, and like, it's a profoundly untrue claim.
Yes.
Just on the face of it.
I think Jack framed it in our conversation. He said something like, yes, of course, we don't mind people being queer as long as they stop being queer."
Yeah. Yes.
As long as they stop acting quite so queerly.
Yeah. Liberalism has always had this problem, and it goes right back to its foundations. Like, John Locke, in his Letter for Toleration, which is worth reading, it's very, very short and is profoundly revealing. It's, I think, one of the great liberalism telling on itself documents. Of course, most sort of like committed liberals absolutely love it because they don't see its failures. But the interesting thing about the Letter of Toleration, considering it's one of the foundational documents of liberal tolerance, and in many ways was a huge progressive document for its time relative to what existed at that point, it is concerned primarily with accepting greater religious diversity. But to do that, it has to spend most of its content attacking Catholicism and atheism as this is what we exclude. Liberalism always needs something that's beyond the pale. It always needs to delimit its tolerance, because tolerance is such a facile concept anyway.
By its very nature,
And I think it always goes for these kinds of targets. And I think Catholicism and atheism are really actually instructive targets for that period, because they're radically different from each other in terms of what they meant for Locke. Because atheism effectively was a non-existent force. Like, there were individual atheists, but there was no force of atheism.
No,
atheism
of course
was a
not.
boogie. It was a philosophical. So attacking atheism was attacking a sort of a straw man, an empty type. Everybody could agree, or pretty much everyone could agree, that to be an atheist was to be a fool, was to be ridiculous. It wasn't really to attack anything that anybody reading that document would disagree with. So this sets up the argument in such a way that the limits to liberalism are framed as very sensible, because of what we exclude is absolutely ridiculous. And then you introduce the actual people you want to persecute, the Catholics, who then are, by juxtaposition with this, boogeyman monster, the atheist, framed as similarly ridiculous, similarly absolutely unpalatable. And I think liberalism has never really dropped that strategy. Like, I think, like, one of the questions I've been really interested in lately is like the obsession with anti-trans jokes in the 1990s,
which is everywhere.
Is weird. And it's so weird because there was no trans movement. Trans people were a tiny force in the 1990s. They were largely, almost universally regarded, if they were regarded at all, as absurd figures.
There was generally no cultural knowledge or representation at all.
And I think it's not surprising that some people would just randomly lash out at this group given their relative irrelevance. But the obsession from it, I think, fulfills the exact same function as the atheist does for Locke. They're the figure that nobody really is going to jump to the defense of in the 1990s. They're not real people in anybody's lives. They're a caricature. So you can define liberal, and these are largely liberal films. I mean, we've got things like Ace Ventura, for example,
which is
like a right-wing reactionary movie. This is like a liberal, progressive, slapstick comedy with largely probably a team of writers and actors and director that think of themselves as liberal and centrist, such and such. And they're defining this, the limits of liberalism against this enemy that there's no stakes for decrying at all. There's no stakes for excluding. And I think, like, then you have the 1990s figure of the Muslim as this horrifying outsider, obviously very similar to sort of anti-Catholic prejudice in Locke's time in terms of like the hysteria around it, in terms of, yeah, I mean, obviously there's the sort of religious connotations, but there's also that sense of having loyalty to outside forces, forces that aren't the nation state. So it's a very similar thing, and liberalism just keeps repeating these patterns because it fundamentally can't be this all-embracing thing of acceptance that it kind of pretends to be.
Right, yeah.
It's just not written into its structure that it can do that.
It always has the overarching agenda of maintaining a certain status quo, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And that's it. And often a delusion of what that status quo was in the first place, if it ever existed at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And like things like trying to distort pride into like that status quo and
into this anodyne space which is prescribed by straight heteronormative culture, where it's non-threatening anymore. It's supposed to be threatening.
Yes.
That's the purpose of it. You know, it's called pride for a reason. You take it's a space to express everything about yourself which you otherwise can't.
I mean, liberalism lost almost all of its radicalism almost as soon as it came into existence because of its dependence on oppressive property relations.
Right.
This, core radicalism against the old regimes and against, what prevailed in the late modern period and the systems of sort of reactionary superstition and stuff. But it couldn't carry them forward, and so it had to immediately double back on itself and decry all of its radical ideas, all of its revolutionary ideas. And in fact, its very revolutionary moments, it had to decry those as well, because they became immediately threatening to it.
Right, yes.
And it's, I mean, Locke is an interesting example because there you've got this, the so-called bloodless revolution, this kind of almost primordial myth of modern Britain, of this glorious revolution, which was in fact a kind of invasion of Britain that was sort of given the stamp of approval by Parliament. And it was, perhaps in certain ways it had progressive elements, although it also had extreme reactionary elements in terms of its ramifications in places like Ireland.
And
it really was this kind of duplicitous thing. It was this kind of weird class collaborationist project between the old regime and the new regime, and this and our liberalism is so marked by this, and I think it's one of the reasons why we have such a sickly form of liberalism today, like even relative to the US. I think the kind of liberalism that prevails in Britain is quite it's quite decayed, and it feels like it always has been.
It feels so indifferent to the forces that it proclaims to be counterposed to. And I think most people sense that, even if they can't articulate it. I think most people sense that malaise that's set in as a result towards established politics. The notion that there is no alternative to what exists.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, like there's no real sense of conviction across the political spectrum of liberalism, whether it's conservatism or sort of whatever is going on in the Labour Party, whatever ideology that even is.
That's a fair point, whatever it is, because it's very difficult to identify at this point, isn't it, as what exactly is going on.
Has a very strange lineage, Labourism, because it's not like the social democratic parties of the continent that go back to a more radical route.
Right.
Like Labourism starts off in antipathy to communism and Marxism, although it has Marxists in it from the beginning. And it's always been this incredibly fraught project. Like the compromises that seeped into the German social democratic parties sort of were baked into Labour and Labourism. And even in its most radical figures like Tony Benn, like in their nationalist nostalgia, which I think is definitely there in Benn, I think that's why that's there. And I'm not like having a big attack on Tony Benn.
No, it's just it's acknowledging what's there, isn't it?
But yeah, I mean, I always think like the problem with Tony Benn is he's seen as an ideological marker, whereas he's just this guy who has these random clusters of nostalgia, occasionally
Mhm.
good politics, occasionally bad
Mhm.
politics, who's not actually that coherent a thinker at all.
Right.
But I don't think there's like really that much ground in Laborism for coherence because it's
No.
such a deeply compromised and fraught project, as most English institutions
Mhm.
are. We're a nation of muddlers, as Ian Foster liked
It's
to say.
so true. It's so absolutely true. And whereas once upon a time that could have been regarded with a certain sentimentality, not anymore. It's been revealed as being a phenomenally dangerous thing on a systemic level.
Yeah, it's one thing when like Toad in the Hole was like this eccentric guy causing car accidents. It's another thing when he's in number 10.
Right,
Um,
right, exactly.
yeah,
Yes,
yeah,
exactly that. Exactly
yeah,
that. And I think on that note, Rowan, shall we bring this one to a close? I know we were going to talk about a few other things, but should we save that for another one?
yeah, absolutely. We should set it up actually because we should
Yes.
talk about. I just got kind of caught into a subject
No,
just to
no,
set it back.
this is
Yeah,
fantastic. No,
yeah,
I do love, I love
mm,
chats that go like this. I really do. It's all
mm,
grist to the mill. It's good fodder, It's
yeah.
good fodder, and it's great fun, I've got to say, because I've been editing. I finished edits to Born in Blood Volume 2 today, and it's been a project. It really has. So it was nice to actually
Mm.
put it aside for a bit,
Oh
to be
yeah, I've
honest.
definitely been there.
It's been, I must say, it's consumed my life for a
Mm.
while. That one, just getting it up to snuff.
Explain
Um,
the numbering of Born of Blood because there's the ones with the photography
yes,
and there's
so there's the photography books and there's the short story collections, which are
right.
kind of separate, even though
Yes.
related. So I think there are 8 volumes of the photography books which have extracts from the short stories in them, and then there are the
Mm.
2 short story collections that have all the stories in them.
Volume 1 and Volume 2. And
Volume
is
1 and
this a
Volume 2.
re-release of Volume 2 then, or is this a new?
No, Volume 2 is new. Volume 2 hasn't been released before. This is its first release.
Okay.
But we're also doing a bundle pack of Volume 1 and 2 together,
Okay.
which is kind of
I
fun.
have a review written for Volume 2, but that might be different or. Oh,
No, the one I gave to you is the one that's being published soon.
Okay. So
Yeah.
that hasn't been
No,
published.
not yet. It's
Oh,
going to be
okay.
published August the 10th.
Okay, that makes sense of it. I was getting very muddled.
Yes, yes, I
I
know.
assumed that was out there in the world.
No, it's not out there yet. It's not. Once it's
Yeah.
out, I will send you a copy because you did the forward for that one, which is very, very
Yes.
kind indeed. Thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. It was really fun to read.
It was no, I mean, because Born in Blood was a bit of an experiment for me, and I've always been a bit as to whether it works or not,
mm,
because it's so out there and so it draws on more of a poetic tradition than a lot of the stuff I write. So I
yeah.
didn't know if it worked for other people or whether it was just a sort of indulgent thing that I should put up on a website or something.
I mean, I really love it, and I think like the thing I love about it is like just how much you have to lose yourself into it.
Yeah.
Like reading Joyce or something.
Hmm.
Like if you try and dissect it or like overinterpret it as you go,
Hmm.
it just won't work.
No, definitely not.
You're just sort of. I mean, one of the brilliant things you do in that, I think, is the way that you set up this unified metaphysics that you then continuously break down
Yep.
and subvert,
Hmm.
and like it actively resists that kind of interpretation, which I think is kind of freeing if you lean into it.
Yeah,
But I can
deliberately
imagine
so.
some people not leaning into it and having
No.
like a bad time
Oh
trying to
yeah.
like yeah.
I've had
But I think
the reactions have been antipodean. People
mm,
either really get it and really enjoy it, or they really, really, really don't.
yeah.
Which
But I
is
concur with
grand.
the metaphors and the poetry of it. Yeah, I mean that's a great thing. I think to like have extreme reactions to something is what you want
Oh,
as a writer.
absolutely. That I
Definitely.
would give me that all day, every day. Give me that. Just yes, please. That's what
Mm,
I want. That's what I want. And yeah, that deliberate inversion, that constant breaking down of mythology was something I did deliberately. Because don't get me wrong, I'm a big fan of well-developed, consistent mythologies. I think that can work brilliantly, but I also think it's a little overplayed.
Yeah, and it's just different. It's a totally
Yeah.
different project to what this is. Although I think this consciously trades on the idea of that
Yeah.
while subverting it, which I quite like. I think that works quite well.
Yeah,
Um,
there's a lot that can be done with Aberice and what there's a lot
mm,
that can be done. I mean, in the first lockdown, I wrote a TV series based on it, and we're
mm,
currently working on getting that sorted, on getting that funded and
mm.
made. Where again, and it does. I mean, the series is, it has to be by its very nature a little bit more sort of coherent, but it does still draw on that notion of inverting itself constantly, of undermining itself constantly, and how people will react to that is going to be really interesting.
Oh, it's good to hear that still going because I did see bits about that, and
Oh
then there's
yeah.
been nothing for a while. But that's really
Oh yeah,
good. Yeah.
it's actually been really exciting. Whether it will come
Mm,
about, I don't know, but we've had interviews with actors and
mm,
things. We're on the edge of getting funding for it. I mean, like my writing partners and the director we've got for it they're very assured that it's a case of when rather than
mm.
if. So, God, it will be very interesting.
Oh, that's really exciting. Yeah,
It will be
definitely.
very interesting to see that. I can tell
Mm,
you. I have no idea how people will respond. I've
mm,
no idea. I think that it'll be very much like the short story collections. People will be like baffled and
mm.
surprised and rather shocked by a lot of
That'll be a
it.
lot of fun.
Yeah, I want to be in a room with people when episodes air. That's what I want.
You need reaction videos. You
Oh
need to
yeah.
encourage people to do.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. In fact, that might be a great way of marketing it. Actually, getting a bit of
Mm,
free marketing, people doing reaction videos on YouTube would be
mm.
grand because most of the reactions would be ones of profound shock. There are some things in it where, like, my writing partners have been, "Are you sure?" I was like, "Yeah, do it. That's why it's there."
Yes. Yeah. There's no reason just to make another film that's been made a million times before.
Exactly.
Like it's yeah, and the same with
Exactly.
stories. Like I mean, I think this is what's so great about what I've seen of sort of contemporary indie horror fiction from the UK. Sort
Hmm.
of yourself and this sort of cluster of people who sort of a lot of whom have appeared on your channel or
Yes.
you talk
Yeah.
to, but and that kind of not like even between these stories, there's not like a coherent through line.
Right.
And it's just this sense of experimentation out there right now
Oh,
that
it's
is
amazing, isn't it? I
so
mean,
exciting.
like on the
Yeah.
small market and indie scene at the moment, that's where horror, science fiction, and fantasy are flourishing like you wouldn't believe. And it's where all the really interesting stuff is happening. I can count on the fingers of one hand the books, certainly the works of horror that were published by mainstream publishers over the last 5 years that have interested me like at all.
Mm.
From small press and independent publishers, I struggle to name them all because there's so many.
Yes. Yeah. There is a lot. And yeah, I'm the same. Like I don't read a lot of like you look at this sort of piles at the front of Waterstones and occasionally there's like something by Margaret Atwood or
Right,
something
right.
that might grab me, but that'll be about it.
That's
And
largely
to be
it,
honest,
yeah.
yeah, even Margaret Atwood's older stuff I generally prefer. So
So
um,
yes.
so even then, it's more likely that I just go to the Margaret Atwood section at the back.
Right, right.
Yeah, it's it is pretty. I mean, at the front of those stores, it's amazing how much stuff is sort of like commentaries on the culture war from either the liberal left or the right.
Right. Or
As like
it's like celebrity ghost authored, just
yes,
just absurd works of trash. You know?
yes.
I can't bear it. I absolutely can't bear it.
I was asked to go for Ghost Store for something once, not by anyone that big, but
Mm,
declined.
yeah.
I feel like it would just not be there's a lot of money in it, though.
Oh
There's so
yeah.
much money in it.
Oh my
It's
God! If you can
ridiculous.
ghost author for like a celebrity or someone like that, but it's like no.
Yeah,
If
it's
it's
just not
my
very
work,
pleasant.
it's going to have my name on it. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. You know.
Just the whole thing of them depicting themselves as writers as well
Oh.
is just so
Did
kind of
you? I
crass.
think the best thing I ever read for the Ginger Nuts of Horror about 5 years ago, Jim, who runs the Ginger Nuts of Horror, managed to get a hold of a book of short horror stories purportedly authored by Joe Pasquale. Right. Clearly not, ghost authored, clearly. And Jim, I mean, his review is fantastic. It's
I can imagine.
he just excoriates it. I mean, and of course, the Ginger Nuts of Horror is a big site. He gets a lot of stuff through, so he's read some trash. He's read some really bad work, but he is unambiguous about the fact that it is the worst collection of horror stories he has ever read.
Considering some stuff that gets published in horror, that is quite a
Yeah,
claim. Like that
right.
is, yeah, you've got to get pretty bad.
Oh God! But it's this
But
notion that just
yeah,
because you're successful or marginally successful in one area, you can do other things as well.
it's a weird kind of lie, but in that everybody knows it's a lie.
Yeah,
Like you're pretending it's a lie. You're pretending it's not a lie. They're pretending it's not a lie. And they're pretending that you don't know that they know
yeah,
that it's a lie, and so on and so forth
yeah.
all the way down. It's just yeah,
It's
I
bizarre,
don't get it.
to say the least. It's bizarre.
I mean, accolades for being rich and famous are a dime a dozen.
Hmm.
To be fair, like you get a certain amount of wealth and fame, and you're given PhDs and all
Yes,
kinds of
yeah.
just random things that don't really make any coherent sense.
Hmm.
But still, even so,
Even so,
it's a strange one.
horror
Um,
stories by Joe Pasquale. There are some stand-up comedians I could actually see that working for, but Joe Pasquale.
yeah, I mean, like the more intelligent stand-up comedians who
Right.
sort of do anti
If
jokes.
Stuart Lee wrote
Yeah,
I'd be sort of like, yeah, I could see that. I could definitely see how he
yeah.
is articulate, literate, and could write something coherent and workable.
I'd be surprised if he did horror, but yeah, I
Yeah,
could definitely see him being able to.
but Joe Pasquale,
Yeah, it's. I mean, it's kind of good it happened, and that it's just a very funny joke in and of itself.
right?
Yeah, it's just amusing.
It's the kind of thing that
Um,
makes you kind of doubt the reality you're in. You want to find the door out of the Matrix, don't you? The red pill.
I
It's
think
like,
there's been that sense for a long time now.
yeah,
I mean, definitely, I always think like the moment Arnold Schwarzenegger became governor, which now seems relatively normal amongst things that have
yes, yeah,
happened, but at the time just seemed ludicrous.
right.
Like that always seems like a kind of moment of like the Matrix is
It's
glitching.
breaking itself. Yeah, the system is
Yes,
breaking down fundamentally now.
yeah,
We're in free fall, we are essentially the operating system on like a really old Windows 3.0 computer.
yes, that's exactly the feeling. Like Windows screen freeze or
Yeah,
something.
yeah, blue
Yeah,
screen of death.
not a sophisticated crash like in the actual Matrix film, but like one of those really naff crashes, like the blue screen or something like
Or just
that.
everything freezing or whatever. Yeah. It's
I used to work at a computer repair shop, so I seen sort of every form of computer malfunction, including one blowing up,
oh wow.
which was the first time. Not in some like visceral Hollywood like pieces flying over the
No.
room way, but in like a loud bang and then like a smell of burnt
Of
innards,
like
and some
ozone
gas streaking
and
out. Yeah. But yes, turns out computers can fail in quite a myriad of ways.
yeah.
But
Brilliant. Absolute
yeah,
brilliance. But yeah, we'll set up a day to talk about Born in Blood and
yeah,
whatnot, yeah?
yeah, and potentially like since it's been some time, maybe Lex could, if he's free.
Yeah, that'd be grand. That'd be
yeah.
absolutely super. And one of the things I'm setting up with Lex at the moment, which could be absolutely brilliant, we are planning on doing commentaries for the extended Lord of the Rings films.
Oh, fantastic!
So that's going to be fun.
I've been meaning to revisit those for ages.
You know what? Those films are really good.
Yeah.
They are apex sort of high fantasy, that kind of fantasy, you know, where it is very prescribed. It is like elves, dwarfs, and so on and so forth, where everything's absolutely good or absolutely evil. But those films are spectacular.
Yeah, they're wonderfully iconic, and they look so apt. Yeah, absolutely.
There's this.
I mean, I'm reading.
Sorry, go on. No, go on.
I was just saying, reading Christine's blog. You know, the stuff she's been writing on Lord of the Rings.
Oh yes, it's been brilliant.
Yeah, I mean, like that's kind of gotten me into for Lord of the Rings quite a lot. Christine Kelly.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I haven't read the books for a long time. I used to read them a lot when I was a kid, but I haven't read them for a long time. And I have an intimation that I probably won't be able to anymore.
They're hard to go back to after like that length of time. I think, especially if you had like an intense I've never had a strong relationship with the Lord of the Rings books. So maybe I could go back to them.
Oh, I did when I was a kid. I had a very strong relationship.
I know a lot of people who did.
Loved them. I was a sort of once a year, every year kind of kid, you know? But I think what tends to happen is you just if you are a reader, if you read things generally, you just move away from them. You kind of grow out of them. I know it's a terrible thing to say, but you kind of do grow out of them because you read things that are better written on a technical level. And then
I've been reading the Gormenghast books.
Oh, I revisited. After that podcast I did with Dave Fagiani, the E-Goats podcast, where we talked about the BBC adaptation. I went back. I've nearly finished reading them now, and they have bowled me over again. Now more than before.
Yeah.
Way more than before. They have completely... I can't believe... I mean, Peake was essentially a contemporary of Tolkien's. He was writing and publishing around the same time. And the stark difference in terms of writing style, the sheer intelligence of Gormenghast is insane.
Yeah, it is a totally different order of literature, and I think it's also just got different ambitions.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, The Hobbit was written as a kind of style exercise, and to see if he could do it.
Yeah,
and he did. I mean, he did produce a very fine sort of children's novella, and then the books are obviously something else. The Lord of the Rings books, but Gormenghast, the third one, of course, draws from experiences he had in the war and the harrowing aspects of that, and not just on some superficial level of this is what a battle feels but on the sense of horror that comes out of these impersonal systems destroying people.
The trauma. The trauma of it is what's so profound in Gormenghast. I mean, the thing that I've taken away this time around is how profoundly damaged every single character is.
Yes. Yeah.
There's not a one. Yeah. There's not a one who is not utterly destroyed by the place and purpose that they're born into.
Yeah. And they're almost sort of just responding to that. There's no the real horror is the sense that they potentially are people who could have had agency, but this world is so soul crushing that it robs them of that. All of them to a person.
Yeah.
With the possible exception of Titus.
Yes, who
kind of gets away.
Finds a way out of it, which is to leave. That's how you do it. You get away from the system. But even characters that are classically represented as archetypes of villainy, like Steerpike, for example, I find that really problematic as a reading of Steerpike because he's no more or less villainous than anyone else in Gormenghast.
No, he's just as a part of this mechanism in every way. He is the natural response of this sort of dehumanization that these systems entail. And what happens to somebody who is brilliant but cannot ascend in any sense, not even personally, not even in terms of their own internal self-worth and identity. And like there are some really interesting moments where he's struggling with what his ideals are in this. Like he clearly can't articulate anything, and he just articulates a bunch of cliches usually. Usually when he's talking to
Fuchsia.
It's
Fuchsia. Usually to Fuchsia when he's talking about equality and whatnot. And you can't really... It's difficult because you can never determine with Steerpike whether he's being sincere or not, even with himself.
Yes. Yeah, I think he almost can't be. Like, he doesn't know how to be sincere.
No, especially after a particular point. After a particular... I find there's a turning point in the book, which is his burning. It's after he's burnt Barkentine to death, the secretary. That sends him down a slightly different spiral to what he initially intended. That makes him almost anarchistic. It makes him like a chaotic element within Gormenghast.
Well, his ambitions are basically just done away with at that point. Like, he can no longer marry Fuchsia. He can no longer ascend in the way that he was. And I think, like, the downfall was always inherently built into his character, but when it kind of arrives, there's this real sense of just, well, if I'm going to burn,
everyone is going to burn. Exactly that. But he is a fabulous character. I mean, I have a lot of time for Steerpike. I have a lot of time for Steerpike because he is essentially, as you say, a product of these systems. He's an abused boy.
Yes,
essentially.
And also, like, on a certain level, like as horrible as he is, like there is a kind of justice to his vengeance, and there is, although you can never really get behind the cruelty, and it becomes, very, very cruel.
Oh, his sadism is pronounced. Like towards the end of the book, it's pronounced. Like the big mistake is his hubris and his sadism. He didn't have to burn Barkentine to death. He could have just slowly poisoned him like he does any number of characters, and that would have been fine. That would have worked. He'd have been fine by then.
Barkentine was so much his antithesis, way more than actually the Queen or Titus ever were. And in a way, like, it's weird because he's set in juxtaposition to Titus, but really Titus exists in a totally different universe.
Titus hardly ever encounters him, really, outside of a functional setting when he's doing his duties as secretary. He's almost an abstract figure for Titus.
Yeah, and vice versa. I think Titus is an abstract figure for Steerpike as well.
It's ironic because if they'd actually bothered to speak, they'd have probably found they've got quite a lot in common. Titus doesn't want to be in this role. Steerpike does. Well, they could have colluded.
Yes. Yeah. I think like that's the tragedy of these systems, that it doesn't allow them to meet in that way. There's no capacity for that.
I mean, my favourite character from this reading is beyond a doubt Fuchsia.
Yes,
beyond a doubt.
I mean, she's very properly tragic because she's just trying to imagine her way out of this, like, and like in different circumstances, she's like an artistic soul, and it's so crushing what's kind of done to her.
Yeah, she is. I mean, what I love about Fuchsia is it's so easy to blame her ultimate tragedy on Steerpike, but actually her trajectory is made plain from the very beginning. Before Steerpike even occurs, before she even meets Steerpike, it's fairly clear what's going to happen to her. Because Gormenghast has not allowed her to be who she is, or who she could be. You see glimmers of it. There's this wonderful contradiction in her where she is incredibly fey and childlike in one respect, and then, certainly towards the end of the book, she has these flashes of absolute intelligence and brilliance.
Yeah. And it's because she's so limited in who she is in those circumstances that she cannot become an adult.
Right.
Despite the fact having this, like, ready potential to do so. And of course she's, in certain ways, in those brilliant insights, her mother's daughter. And her mother's brilliance is also kind of tragic in this really perverse way.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, for starters, like, she's just a case of somebody who is against any wishes forced into motherhood.
Yep.
Like somebody who profoundly is unsuited to being a parent in any way and doesn't wish to be a parent in any way. Like there's a fantastic comedic line like "Bring him back to me."
Bring him back when he's 6. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah, and like she's incredibly intelligent.
She is. She's described as having this glacial intelligence.
Yeah.
Where she perceives so much, but she doesn't express it. So Steerpike, there's a point towards the end where it's described that Steerpike largely tries to stay away from her because he can't get a bead on her. Unlike Fuchsia, whom he understands immediately. From the moment he first sees her, he understands exactly what to do with her. Prune Squalor knows exactly what to say. The Countess, Gertrude, she's an unknown factor to him.
Yeah.
And it turns out, of course, that unlike Titus, who is really no match for Steerpike in terms of intelligence or capacity, she is.
No, she is the foil, ultimately. She's the barrier he can't surpass. Because she is brilliant. I mean, she's the kind of confluence of both privilege and brilliance that occasionally happens in these systems. And I guess, and like Titus is actually very mediocre. Like his ability to escape those systems is more kind of down to his will of personality than any kind of insight into the systems.
It's not because of any injustice. I mean, he's a petulant child ultimately.
Yes.
It's because he doesn't want to do it. That's ultimately it.
There's kind of a laziness, and there's that sense of he could have had something better that was more free. Which obviously goes back to his fostering as a baby and his relationship with the girl outside the city.
Yes, Kida and his foster sister.
Yeah, and that kind of sense that he has this kind of connection to something more primordial and real.
Well, Steerpike says it at one point. When he's talking to Fuchsia at one point, he says of Titus, is that a brother? He's too wrapped up in himself that he can't even take what's given to him.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, Titus, I guess, is a foil to Steerpike in that way, though, because Steerpike just cannot imagine somebody refusing power.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't compute.
Yeah, and for the most part, he never encounters anybody who doesn't.
No.
Like Fuchsia and Titus are probably amongst the few, and maybe the academics.
Yeah.
But they're just sort of like bumbling and privileged and protected.
They're a different. They're almost like in a different sphere. The academics, the teachers, the teacher subplot exists in its own strange kind of annex to the main story.
Feel like the rest of the book
at
all. Like that whole romance plot. I'm not even sure I entirely like it. Like it seems to interrupt the flow of the first novel.
Irma and Belgrove. I mean, I love Irma to bits.
Yes.
Irma is one of my favourite characters. Really well realised in the TV series as well. But yes, her romance with Belgrove. It does operate aside from the main story rather than feeding into it.
Yeah, in a different genre, really. I think that's the thing that comes through. I mean, the casting is great. Like Stephen Fry is well cast.
As Belgrove, perfect. And who is it who plays Irma? It's I can't remember her name offhand, but I know it's John Sessions who plays Alfred Prune Squalor.
Yes,
and he just embodies the character, like in every particular, his poise, the way he moves, that very particular titter that by which he punctuates every statement. It's that is just superb, and I must say I do relish the moments in the TV series where they're together.
Yes,
just bouncing off one another. the statements are wonderful.
The casting is just phenomenal, and the way that the casting is, creates this great set of interactions. Like the people who are cast, they're not just good in their roles; they're good in their roles against the other people who are cast in their roles. Like it really just comes. It's one of those amazing adaptations, actually, that has no business being as good as it is.
I know, right? I can't believe that it occurred when it did, because there was nothing like that on television at that time.
Yeah. It's so good that I would be against them remaking it because I
Yeah.
just don't believe they could live up to it. Like,
Well,
I would be shocked.
By
if
all
they
accounts, there has been Neil Gaiman has been trying to write a script for a movie version of Gormenghast for a long time. It's been in development hell for quite a while. Whether it will ever occur, I don't know. I'm not sure a film is the right format. I think a TV series
Yeah.
is the right format myself.
It's a hard story to compress, especially
It's thankless to adapt at all. I mean, all power to anyone who has a go at it.
Yes, yeah. I mean, in a way, I don't mind. Like, if there's a bad adaptation, I just shrug and move on. Like,
right.
It's not worth getting upset about.
But it's a hard thing to do.
I would have low expectations
to capture the ethos of the book, which I think the BBC adaptation does rather well. Actually, I think it's a rather beautiful piece of work. It has that heightened theatricality which works so well.
It's of its time, but that theatre element helps it in that respect.
I
because
think
it doesn't.
So.
Yeah.
If they went for sort of like the hyper real, that slightly Game of Thronesy aesthetic where everything is trying to be a bit too gritty for its own good, I don't think it would work.
It would have dated really quickly. Like, it might have worked in the immediate time, but I think by now it would just be boring.
And you know what? The characters are strange, and they do react in odd ways, and they have these odd lines that come out of nowhere and these flights of poetry, and you need to have that. For it to work, for it to distinguish itself, it needs to have that. And I like the overly theatrical performances in the BBC adaptation. I like the fact they have all of the flowery lines and the strange physicality that they all have.
Whimsy is so much baked into Gormenghast as a story, and like to lose that, like that Dickensian quality to the books.
Well, there are these weird. I mean, the teachers subsection aside, there are all these weird flights where these moments where it's just describing the characters doing things, nothing in particular, that don't really relate to the story at all. They're just doing things, and sometimes they're doing very strange, idiosyncratic things, but which enhance them as characters.
Beginning of the first book, I mean, you aren't introduced to a character, you're introduced to the place through characters. So you go around Gormenghast from person to person. I love that opening. I've tried to replicate it, and it's really difficult to do.
It starts with Rotcod, doesn't it? Up in the Hall of Bright Carvings, one of the least significant characters in the entire book. It starts with him, and the first book ends with him as well. And it's just him learning of Titus's birth.
Yeah.
That's it. I mean, Flay happens to stumble into the Hall of Bright Carvings for reasons, and happens to inform him in his peculiarly stilted way, Groan is born. And that's it.
Yeah.
That's
it. And you just get more of a sense of the place and the people, which is absolutely right, because like the main character of Gormenghast, even in the third book, which isn't situated there, is the castle city.
It's Gormenghast itself. It's Gormenghast,
and Gormenghast has a person, and he's the Gormenghast. It is the antagonist as well. It's the thing that everybody cannot get past. Cannot. I mean, even I guess Titus, who kind of escapes, ultimately can't escape the shadow of Gormenghast in the sort of wasteland outside.
Well, in book 3, of course, he's seeking to get back to Gormenghast, isn't he? Or not even to get back to Gormenghast, but to reify to himself that it's real.
Yes, actually, just to say that Gormenghast was there. I mean, I think there's kind of probably a play on sort of, because Gormenghast represents the sort of the worst elements of the sort of medieval superstition, and there's those systems of control based on absolute unbreakable hierarchies.
Right.
The world outside is this cold, Kafkaesque modernity that's indifferent to human life.
Right. And it is such a stark difference, isn't it, from what Gormenghast is in the first 2 books.
And he's almost trying to say, like, this past happened.
Right.
Like, there was a time before this. And I think, like, that actually tracks onto the themes of the original, because I think in some ways, like, I kind of talked about the sort of perversity of liberal revolutions earlier. Like, I think Steerpike represents that perversion. Like he has this opposition to the systems of power that exist, but his only idea is to erect new oppressive systems of power.
Yes, his own
and,
oppressive systems of power. Yeah,
and he's very much the herald of the modernity that exists outside of Gormenghast. And like I think, in actually ways that look naive compared to how horrifying it is, presages that horror.
It's fascinating because, the TV series aesthetically represents that. When he becomes secretary after he's burned Barkentine to death, there are scenes shot in the Great Library where he has his offices, and it deliberately changes the lighting and the setup where they become anodyne. They become like modern offices. There are even electrical lamps set up, and there are people at typewriters. That's representing modernity, right?
Yeah,
it's very clever.
That reminds me of that Richard the Third adaptation, where the sort of villainous main titular character is depicted in the stylings and trappings of Nazism. And like it's I think that's I'm gonna say Ian McKellen.
It's Ian McKellen. Yeah, it's Ian McKellen,
and that's just really well done. Like I think that's a very similar metaphor that's being sort of
very much so.
And like looking at these sort of the intimations of authoritarianism in the early modern period in Shakespeare's politics and the politics he's commenting on, and I think that's like very much a deliberate thing that Mervyn Peake is doing, like thinking about, and he does have this kind of a plague in all houses kind of approach to it, which is very delightful.
Yeah. He's cruel. He's cruel to his characters. There's no two ways about it. With purpose. Don't get me wrong.
Yes.
It's with purpose, but it is cruelty nonetheless.
Yeah. Yeah.
Nobody has good endings. Nobody.
Yeah. And it's a much bleaker story than I think people sometimes realize. Like there is no real. I think people realize if they read the third book, but a lot of people don't.
Right. If you read the third book, there is very much the intimation that Gormenghast sort of stops without Titus. Yeah.
It almost ceases to exist.
Right.
Like without that system, and it's saying like it's almost Arthurian, like the king didn't return.
Right. So and without the king, what of the kingdom? There is nothing without the groan. Barkentine actually states that very much. When Sepulchrave goes missing, when he dies, he feeds himself to the owls. They search for him for 9 days, and Barkentine stops it and says, with greatest respect, ladyship, what does it matter? He is earls come and earls go. We need the new earl. It doesn't matter who it is, we just need to have someone in place. The fact that it's like this 9-month-old child doesn't matter.
Yeah, the systems are impersonal. Right. That's actually very true to, I think, medieval concepts of kingship. Like, they weren't people in that sense, at least not in terms of the role that they fulfilled. And of course they were people and they did all kinds of individual terrible things.
Oh, yes.
Such and such. But their symbolic role in society was not as like celebrities as we imagine today, where their personality is really important. No one cared about the personality of the king.
It's what they are. It's what they represent, isn't it? It's what it's the idealism and the mythology attached to them that matters.
Yeah. And that system of depersonalization, of course, then is re-articulated in the third novel in terms of the sort of depersonalized world of capitalist modernity, I guess, and the systems of power. The antagonist in that, I can't remember her name, but she's like mocks Titus towards the end for having these fantasies.
Yes.
She erects a sort of stage production of the first book based on his rambling.
It's a running gag throughout the third book where he introduces himself as Titus 77th Earl of Gormenghast, and people say, what? It's like if you or I went out onto the street and started proclaiming ourselves Emperor of such and such. That's how people react to him.
Yeah. He exists outside of their life world,
right?
Anyway, and they outside of his, and that's like the horror of the third book, that he can kind of. I guess like his whole thing is sort of trying to find some human freedom in the world.
Yeah.
And never being able to discover
Never
that.
being able to do it because he's trapped in his own skull, of course. That's ultimately it. He's bound in a way he can't escape. There's also, I mean, there's a personal element to it as well as the ideological element. Mervyn Peake suffered from a degenerative neurological condition and was effectively losing his mind at the time of writing the third book. So there is that element as well, which expresses itself in both the story and the prose. I've very rarely read a book like it where you can actually feel the writer's degeneration in the prose.
There's a sense of disassociation in the novel that is quite profound and
Yeah.
actually quite frightening in that book.
Yeah.
Actually, like I think he conveys that experience. You get that occasionally in Kafka, although
Yeah.
usually sort of slightly subdued by the lens of sort of absurdist humor.
You get it a lot in the later works of Philip K. Dick when he was
Yes.
also losing his sanity. Valis is the big one. Valis is a portrait of a mind collapsing under its own weight.
Yeah. I mean, I think the tragedy of Dick is that ability to understand what was happening to him in a profound level. Like he got the process, and of course he'd experienced it from the outside so many times because of his past.
Right, I mean, you read books like A Scanner Darkly, and he's commenting upon it. He's commenting upon his own degeneration.
Yeah.
It's horrific in many respects.
Yeah. I mean, his sense of what is real and what is not is unlike any other author. Like, I feel like Dick is, alongside Blake, a kind of Gnostic, mystic writer. And I think he's only kind of incidentally a science fiction writer. Like, he's no more emphatically that than Blake is, like, emphatically like a writer of epics. Like, it's whatever medium can express these spiritual truths.
Absolutely.
And it's the spiritual truths that are important.
It's ultimately identity, I find, with Philip K. Dick. He's obsessed with the notion of assumptions and prescriptions of identity, and that is what he explores. The fact that he explores it through tropes or subjects that are generally considered to be science fiction is kind of incidental.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, it's about person's place in a spiritually disintegrating universe, and like what's beyond that, and is there some hope? And, like, at different moments he intimates that there is or isn't.
A lot of the time it isn't in Philip K. Dick. You often get stories where there's the drawing away of the veil for in whatever way that happens, whether it's literal or metaphysical or whatever, where characters peel themselves back and realize that they're not who they think they are, or that they are reborn into some other state or sphere. But there is almost always some kind of authoritarian system that's prescribing that.
Yeah, there's something else beneath it. I mean, that's the sense, this kind of cosmic horror sense of you peel back the illusion to discover another illusion.
It's illusions all the way down.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, like they definitely had Dick in mind, I think, in The Matrix, where it sort of revealed that the systems of Zion are themselves part of the prescribed order that the machines have set up.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very classically... I mean, I think there's loads of things in The Matrix that aren't Dickian at all, but I think that's a very classic Dickian trope. And yeah, I mean, he was brilliant at doing that.
He really was. I mean, his work is... I have to build up to reading Dick a lot of the time because it's often very profound, very traumatic, and it often excites paths of thought which can very easily lead to a nihilism, which is kind of dangerous.
Yeah, I think he's a difficult writer to think alongside. I mean, he doesn't have... the comparison to Blake is limited in that respect, because I think Blake has this overriding sort of love of everything, this sort of mystic love of everything. Like, everything is holy.
Yes,
kind of.
It's the inversion almost, isn't it? I mean, in Dick's world, nothing is holy because it's very often all illusion. It's flimsy. It doesn't matter.
I think Dick is constantly trying to find the authentic that is holy. Like, that's what he's after.
It's a seeking after, isn't it? Whereas Blake tries to tell you what it is. Blake assumes he knows what it is,
Yeah, Yeah, and I think felt it on a very visceral level.
Yeah,
Like I think he felt
he
that.
experienced it. That's definitely true. He experienced it in his own mind.
Mm, mm.
But
Yeah,
yes, right. I think shall we cut that one off there, Rowan? And
yeah. I was just suddenly aware that I
yeah.
probably kept you an hour over after
No,
you
no, it's no. It,
previously
it was a
said that.
great conversation. I'll include
Yeah,
all of this. Will go in. All of this will go in.
excellent. Yeah, it's
Um,
been really
no,
enjoyable
it's been
as
grand.
always.
It's been a lovely chat. It's been very. I must say, after several days of just intense editing for Born in Blood
Mm.
Volume 2, it's been lovely to decompress.
Yeah,
Really lovely.
I mean, I'm editing all the time, so I definitely get that. Like, it's very, you get lost in that world quite
Yeah.
easily,
Oh,
and especially when you're editing your own
oh,
work,
it gave
like
me a
because of your level
headache.
of,
It gave me a
yeah,
headache. I mean, it's just it's lovely to be able to have that done now. It's
yes,
out of my hands now. It can go and it can toddle off and do what it likes in the world now. So that's
uh,
fine. That's good. I can absolve myself of the responsibility.
mm,
But yes, when we come back, shall we chat about Born in Blood Volume 2?
absolutely. I look
Grand.
forward to it.
Just slap me. Just if I start wandering off
I think
about
I did it as much as you this time. Like, I got into No Man's Sky, and then like the conversation went on from there.
honestly, please
Um,
just get a stick,
but
reach through the
yeah.
screen and prod me with it or something.
I just
Something
think
to that effect.
if we have oh someone else there
A moderator.
yes, somebody sort of like to
So, a
just
Kerala.
like
Someone to keep us in
yeah.
line.
I mean, Lex can definitely get lost in tangents too, just like us.
Uh,
But maybe the three of us together, sort of trying to keep us all on
maybe
track.
we'll
Oh
somehow keep one another on
yeah,
track. Maybe we
yeah,
will. Grad, is that
yeah.
before we go? Is there anything you'd like to pimp out?
I mean, just the usual. If you go to my Twitter at rt_editing, my pinned tweet has my blog, Patreon, a couple of other things I've done, and books I've published. So you can find all my stuff there. Yeah.
Okay, no worries. I will put links below, ladies and gentlemen. I will also put links to Citizens of Nowhere, which was a short story collection which Rowan published, I believe, and which has 3 of my short stories in it, I do think.
Yes.
Which was,
Microfiction and 2 sort of short stories. Yeah.
yeah, that was great fun. It was really, really enjoyable, that was. I'll put links to that below, as well as the Born in Blood to pre-order page, obviously. As for myself, the usual, Born in Blood Volume 2 is up for pre-order right now, and there's also a bundle pack of 1 and 2 together for pre-order. All of my other stuff you can find links to over at strangeplaygrounds.com, and also you can find me knocking about here on Exaggerated Elegy, where we're currently doing finishing off Resident Evil 7, which is loads of fun, and we're also really deep into Dark Souls 3 again,
Mm.
which is fab.
I'm looking forward to the second part of Punch Guy Joe's.
I
Yes,
love that.
he's wonderful. Just
What?
yeah,
What?
beating up zombies.
I
Zombies that aren't things that you would normally want to beat up.
you wouldn't want to touch, would you?
No,
I mean, you just wouldn't
would
want to touch them with your bare skin.
wouldn't want to be on the same planet as really.
No,
But
no,
yes,
you certainly don't want to be breathing in the proximity of them. But yes, Joe and his mighty fists of fury, that's also happening right now. Rowan, thanks so much. It's been lovely to chat and decompress. It's been really, really nice.
likewise.
Excellent. And thank you guys for listening to us ramble on. Thank you so much. Until next time, my loves. Bye-bye.
Bye.